listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states and the surface of our increasingly divided globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Alrighty, July 20th, it is 7 a.m. Eastern in the morning, folks, and I hope everybody's having a good one. Let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, there were about 55,828 new COVID cases reported in the United States yesterday. If you've been paying attention to the numbers and you care, your eyebrows are probably already raising. There were also about 622 new deaths, but with that new crazy high case count for a single day, that leaves us with an average of about 35,000 cases per day over the past week. That's 198% higher than the average 2 weeks before. So that is not double, but approximately triple the case load that you had before. You know that 100% increase would be double. A 200% increase is approximately, it is triple. This is a 198% increase, though. Anyway, as of this morning, this leaves the coronavirus having infected about 34,097,758 people across the United States. It has killed 608,811 people in the U.S. New COVID cases and hospitalizations in the United States are predominantly among the unvaccinated, surprise, with 95% of cases and 93% of hospitalizations among those who haven't yet received a vaccine. In Louisiana, 97% of the state's cases and deaths since February have been among the unvaccinated. Again, not too much of a surprise. I might want to come back to this, but there's a little bit of a... You haven't seen that chart that occasionally people have been floating around about like the Israel case counts and hospitalizations in vaccinated versus unvaccinated folks, and people are using this as an argument. Look at all the people with COVID who've gotten vaccines.
I haven't seen that particular chart because, I take that stuff with a grain of salt when I see it. I tend to lean on the side of vaccinations tend to work. The scientists are backing it.
I hear you.
Pushing that type of stuff.
I
So
like
tend
to confront it face first because then I'm like, okay, what are they actually saying here? Because if they're
but to be fair, I haven't seen the chart.
Yeah. So anyway, my point with that is, if most of the population has been vaccinated and you have new variants that some people can catch even if you have been vaccinated, well, you're going to get cases among the vaccinated.
Of course.
And if the vast majority of the population is vaccinated, you're going to get a lot of cases. In fact, probably most of the cases among the vaccinated, just because most people are vaccinated. And so some people are still going to get sick. And because most people are in that group, I think you get my point. Even though it's overall less likely, it might seem like implausible or something, but it makes perfect damn sense. And if you look at the actual, severity of the cases and the number of deaths, way down.
That part.
Yeah.
If you're looking at severity and you're saying, my monologue is on this because I had a conversation about this yesterday where I didn't particularly like how yesterday's show towards the end went, and I couldn't figure out why, because everybody was like, dude, good show. And I think producer was like, she's a great foil, talking about Kim.
Yes,
and I was like, yeah, you're right, she really is. And as I placed it,
she's too good a foil.
She's too good of a foil. No, but she made me question whether or not I was in a bubble on this stuff. And it took me a while to reconcile, but the answer was no, I don't think I am. This is a big deal, man. And the numbers, we were at 5,000 people dropping dead a day, to put it in perspective. And so it's like, yeah, I tend to be a little edgy on the whole coronavirus thing when I'm seeing the numbers spike to 300% over the course of a few days.
I hear you.
Look, yes, people could still get infected, even if they get the vaccine. Of course. There was always going to be breakthroughs. There are no vaccines that are perfect.
That's why it's like 93 to 95% efficacy rate.
Exactly.
I think that's kind of built into it. When people are talking about, okay, the Johnson & Johnson shot is more effective, but less effective than the Pfizer or the Moderna shots, which is, of course, the narrative, because of the lower efficacy rate. What are you actually saying there? It's not. What does the efficacy mean? If you think it through,
it's not perfect.
It's not perfect.
It's never been perfect.
No.
And beyond that point, are your chances more likely or less likely to die with the vaccine? Well, you're less likely to die with the vaccine.
Like
you're less likely.
20 times less likely.
By major injury, you're less likely. So, I get people wanting to make hay out of the vaccines. They don't want to find reasons to justify not getting it.
I hear you.
The problem is, contextually, they're wrong.
I kind of want to come back to this because I've got more to say on this, but we have headlines. One quick note with the Kim. No, you're good. One quick note with the Kim discussion. I've noticed that if you are in a bubble, if you pronounce it buble, you have a slightly
not as bad.
you have a slightly easier chance of like escaping the bubble because you just don't take it as seriously. In the same way that like if you have deep trauma, if you just pronounce it twama, you'll work through it so much faster.
Not as bad anymore.
You got to trivialize it. No, I'm just kidding. Sometimes you can't with these things. In national news, Donald Trump predicted that TV news ratings would slump following his departure from the Oval Office, and so far he isn't wrong. Since a sharp jump in January following the election and January 6th, ratings for both primetime news and newspapers, including the New York Times, have consistently slumped compared to where they were last year. CNN is most deeply affected among TV news outlets. Its primetime audience has dropped 45% in the last few weeks. I'm not unhappy about that, Jamarl. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has announced plans to float the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill in the Senate with a vote set for tomorrow, this Wednesday. He's received some pushback with Ohio Senator Rob Portman saying we shouldn't have an arbitrary deadline of Wednesday, quote unquote. But Chuck Schumer apparently wants to sort of test this, send this out as a trial balloon, although a much beleaguered and diminished trial balloon.
Focusing the mind.
What'd you say?
He's focusing the mind.
Yes.
That's what it is.
A rioter from the January 6th Capitol breach has been given an 8-month prison sentence for his felony. A crane manager from Florida who breached the Capitol has been given the first punishment of all the rioters and will serve as the precedent for the punishment of others. In international news, Peru is set to declare Pedro Castillo as the new president over Keiko Fujimori. The official announcement will be sometime next week, but the National Jury of Elections has announced that Castillo beat Fujimori by 44,058 votes. Haiti's acting Prime Minister Claude Joseph stepped down yesterday and is being replaced by Ariel Henry. These changes follow the assassination of former Haitian Prime Minister Jovenel Moïse 13 days ago. We will be talking about this with Danny Shaw at about 8:30. In tech news / international news, a major report released this weekend by the OCCRP, Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, Citizen Lab, and dozens of other organizations, highlights the company NSO Group and its Pegasus malware service. This has been breaking all over the media. This service has been used by dozens of governments and government-affiliated agents and agencies to target domestic dissidents for spying by using zero-day exploits to access their phone's most basic functions. Implicated in the use of Pegasus include the governments of India, Azerbaijan, and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, although there are many others on that list. NSO Group has, by the way, said they've denied all this stuff, basically. They've said they have a strict vetting process, that the number of cases in the main report has dropped from 50,000 to 100 to 50 to 12. They've lambasted this. They've talked about how they've talked about different sides of this. But my point is, they've said that, but they also can't come out with an official list of their clients. And so there's this weird dance where in public, they're speculating about where exactly Citizen Lab sourced their data. They're like speculating about the speculation or something like that. And so it's just this weird dynamic. We'll be coming back to this, though. In more tech news, NFT market, non-fungible token market, OpenSea hit a massive $1.5 billion valuation. The company stated that the biggest growth problem they have is due to infrastructure issues with the Ethereum blockchain. I have an idea. What if what if you had like a field of NFTs that you grew and they looked like tulips? And then you tried to increase the value of those NFTs. That would be a good move. In Earth and Science news, Jeff Bezos will be launching into space today at 9 a.m. Eastern. This comes weeks after Richard Branson beat the former Amazon CEO to the U.S. legal definition of space at 86 kilometers. Bezos' Blue Origin flight is expected to go about 106 kilometers high. The Kármán line, more universally believed to be the start of space, is set at 100 kilometers high. And again, Branson didn't pass that. Bezos' flight also marks the first entirely civilian space crew with 100% autopilot flight sequences. Back home, 185,000 people have signed petitions to stop Bezos from returning to Earth. That will keep him away, I'm sure. The weight of the petitions, it's like a barrier, preventing his re-entry into the atmosphere. Anyway, let's close this segment out. Those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I don't know, Jamarl, what do you think about my barrier idea?
I don't know. Stuff like that. If any of those people who signed that petition were Bezos, would they be doing the same thing?
I like the idea that Bezos signed that petition so many times. It's like, I just want to go to Mars.
I just want to go to Mars, man. I don't know. I guess my thought is, if we were in Bezos' shoes, would we be doing something similar? And I think the thought is yes.
No.
You don't think so? You don't think we would be trying to blast ourselves to space?
I wouldn't have started Amazon. I would be like on a bike tour somewhere. I'd be happy with retiring,
right there.
Retiring at a couple $100,000 or whatever.
When people say that, what they're saying though is, if I am me, and I was plunged in the Bezos shoes at this moment, what would I do?
Yeah.
And I don't know, like that's a tough one. It's like if we had the capacity to keep track of all of humanity, let's say all of this stuff was projected from somewhere else and all of this stuff was in a database and in a file somewhere else. And we could say, all right, Shane, now that we're at the spot, I can run you through various simulations. So I can run all of the populations through various simulations. So 70% of the population does X, 10% does Y, 4% does, this. And Shane, you're in the 20 percentile, or you're in the 2 percentile of people who do something different. It's that, what we're basically talking about. And I don't know how that entirely looks. I think if I was Bezos, I probably would be trying to go to space. I would probably be more like Musk. I would just be, enamored by what I could do with the wealth, and building stuff like that myself, like kids building toys and saying, all right, I'm going to try to go to Mars. I'm going to try to do this. I'm going to try to do that. I'm going to build tech for this. I'm going to build tech for that. I think it would be that. I don't know if for all of the bow that we throw on politicians and everything else, I really do think at the end of the day, they're us. And that until we are different, they're not going to be different. And this doesn't give them a pass, or this doesn't give people a pass in regard to what they're doing. I guess my point is, all of those people who are signing that list for saying Bezos should stay out, would they be different? And I don't know if they would be.
But I also don't know that that's a serious. I think that they're mostly joking.
They're joking.
It's like,
I think some of them are joking.
Yeah.
I think some of them are true believers.
Well, I also don't doubt that many of the people who are joking are like, don't like Jeff Bezos, and they're doing that to mock him.
That's
but,
my point. Yeah.
But, what's the expectation there? No, I mean, this discussion gets a little bit weird for me just because, like, without explicitly talking about it, all of the conversation happens within this lens or this set of assumptions about, like, okay, how do we view the rich? What are our assumptions about the rich in our society? What roles or responsibilities? Like, what should they be doing? Because if you look at the issue of space, for instance, what have rich people historically done with their wealth? Thrown lavish parties, thrown feasts, procured for themselves various luxury items, created monuments occasionally. Space is a fairly productive use of the resources of the wealthy. And yet any conversation that we have about how the wealthy are going to use the resources assumes some like moral judgments about wealth, about all these things. Yeah. It's loaded with these preconceptions. Class, personal emotions, all of our personal anxieties about our financial insecurities, all of that stuff comes into it. And it's all relevant to it. It pertains to it. Therefore, it's not, like I can or should try to dismiss it.
No. I don't think people should dismiss it. I think, yes, I agree with you. I think a lot of the stuff is built into it. And so in their heads, it's like, well, Bezos is going to space, even though you have all these people that are about to lose their homes. It's that, where it's this value judgment of, okay, what is money to be used for, and is it to be used for X or Y? I do agree with you that this is productive, but I disagree that they've always just for parties. I mean, oftentimes money has been used to make more money. And yes, parties and everything else, but the parties is secondary to the fact that it's being used to make more money. And you've had this industrial era where that stuff was being used for the productive capacities, was being used in real terms to build the world and to build the country and everything else. Space is similar in that. I mean, this is where I disagree with Richard Wolff. And there are a lot of people, and we had, I think, Grumbine on yesterday saying people don't have a appetite for revolution. Okay. There is a scenario where if the world was a closed environment, let's say it was a closed loop, there was no way out, then the socialists may have a point. Because they may say, okay, well, it gets to a point where there's nowhere else to expand, people get very angry, and it turns in on this, okay, but what happens when you have space and you have asteroids, you have planets, and you have all of these businesses and all of these little things that, okay, I need a widget for this, and somebody needs to build a widget for this particular thing, for this particular ship to go in this way. Meaning, it's not a closed environment. And because it's not a closed environment, can you get this thing where it moseys along, where people aren't in an appetite for revolution, despite the fact they're unhappy? Yeah. Meaning you get this dystopian environment where it's not enough to tip it, but not enough for people to remain happy and calm. You get this in between of just of random unhappiness, not necessarily giving out to everybody else, the rich getting in, trillionaires, that type of stuff.
That sounds, in a broad sense, like the status quo, though. That just sounds like human history writ large or something.
That's my point. Like, it doesn't necessarily need or mean that there would be this kind of grand revolution of things, even though it could trend that way. Well, I'm just saying that the moment that you add space into the mix, you add a borderless frontier.
Maybe. Potentially borderless.
Potentially, yeah.
Different.
What would be the border? I mean, the border would be the limits of our technology.
Borders are a bit more natural when you get around habitable objects specifically, and not just ones that you've created like space stations and things. This sounds like, again, we start having these conversations, people are going to be like, what are you guys? debating between Star Trek and Star Wars.
No.
But this is all if we're being at least slightly optimistic about the rate of where we're going as a species, as a planet.
No.
We're probably going to be in space soon, and so these are relevant conversations, I think, to start having.
But this is a conversation about Bezos and Musk.
Well, but you're talking borders. This
billionaires
is slightly
in space.
further future than where we are right now.
I don't think so. I mean, Elon Musk has put those Starlight things in space to get internet service and everything else.
Starlink, yeah.
Starlink. You have 3 billionaires that are basically showing off their products for space.
100%. No, I'm just saying definitions of sovereignty. And here's my brief stipulation on sovereignty in space. It's going to be more likely and more feasible to maintain when you're around objects, when you're around either planetoids or planets, when you're around, stellar objects specific.
This asteroid specifically.
I'm near this thing because otherwise you're awash. It's like international waters. You're just in the open seas, and it's not just 2 dimensions along this spherical plane that we're on. It's in 3 dimensions where the directions that you can go, instead of being squared, it's cubed. I don't mean to get too deep into it, but like you can go so many more directions. Therefore, being able to maintain borders is a lot harder. You need to keep it in more spaces, and therefore it only makes sense to maintain them around things that have some value.
No, you're being too specific about what I'm saying. What I mean is just, if you have an enclosed environment, that's one thing. But space takes away that. I mean, and so the limits of our technology basically are our borders at that point. But you're going to have billionaires, or you're going to have people who are trying to do business in space. That's an entire point.
Totally. Yeah.
But that's what I mean. I don't think it's not far field if these guys are basically showing off their technology, saying, we can do this. Well, you need business in space. We're the companies for you to come for.
Well, totally. And if we look at what happened during the previous era of exploration, from the 14 to the 1700s approximately, although you can put it a bit later than that. What do? You had the large trade companies, where either the Dutch or the British East India companies, corporations, model for modern day corporations, these massive behemoths, where the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, or VOS, I believe, the largest corporation, not at the time, but ever, larger corporation, larger international entity than any we've seen since.
Right.
Think about that for a second. And it was the first one, essentially. That set this stuff in motion. What was that? That was a collaboration between a large private enterprise, a bunch of people investing in it, becoming shareholders. There's kind of the population.
And governments.
And governments. The crown,
it's like, we give you, the crown gives you its authority to go out and
oranges of Netherlands and
exactly,
and the English too.
But I hope you get my point, though. I don't think it's far field, nor do I think it's, I guess I'm trying to engage your conversation saying, like, look, when people think about billionaires and everything else, they think about all these other things that go along with it. And this notion that space is a productive use of it. And I'm saying, yes, it's a productive use of it. That doesn't stop necessarily people from saying, keep them out. And from the standpoint of this notion of what happens with that, these guys are showing off their technology, saying we're capable of doing X and Y. And right now, it may be just transport. It may be just, okay, we're going to take people up for rides.
Yeah, right now
it's not going to stop there.
No, of course not. It's not going to stop there.
It's not stopping there.
But the tourism is the exploratory technology that gets you kind of like, it does the technological progress in the same way almost that if you look at what Elon Musk did with Tesla, he started out with the more expensive sports cars that were, you can produce in smaller batches. You're going to make a higher margin on per unit that you sell.
Build others,
and you can invest in the technology. You can sort of push your standards up and then use all of the research and R&D that you've done to raise the level of development of any other product, no matter how expensive or cheap it is. You get
that. Because they need the money in order to even do it. They need to even build up the infrastructure for that stuff. Because look, what I wager is they're going to start trying to pull elements from asteroids and stuff like that. If we on this planet, and we need to close it, but if we're on this planet and we say, all right, we're sick of mining stuff because we don't like what it does to the environment. Climate change is an issue. All of these things are issues. So maybe, what if we could mine it off-world? And at that point, it's going to be like, okay, is there profitability in mining it off-world? Governments are going to get involved.
And say, okay,
it's going to be that, which is why I think the tourism stuff, hey, I'm Bezos, I'm in space, you can trust my company to do this stuff. I think all of that stuff falls in line, and I think what we're going to see, look, man, I think our world is going to change. And I think the space stuff,
of course.
Well, yeah, of course, right? But I think the space stuff is just, it's harking to something else. Like because whatever they're doing in space, they're going to be things that are required on Earth that are going to be downstream products that are going to need to be made, built, manufactured, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And that's why I don't think, when I'm saying borderless, don't take it as like a country border. I just mean...
Okay, and here's the other thing. You're talking about asteroid mining. Again, this is sci-fi technically in a sense. But like,
I don't think it is. I don't think it is.
No, but it still is in that territory. And that's, or speculative fiction, whatever. That's useful to do often. But you go into asteroids, if you're extracting resources there, what do you do with those? You don't bring those back down to Earth to smelt. especially if you're trying to create things in space, you have on-site manufacturing. Now, do you have people in those facilities, or do you use
they're doing that in Mars now,
drones?
so it's not.
Do you use robots? What is the economy of this place that we're looking like look like?
Right.
And then furthermore, there are a limited number of resources, theoretically, that we can expand to. Our conversation, everything that we have about this, is not a limitless frontier if we can't escape the gravity well of our solar system, in a broader sense. If we can't get out of the solar system.
The limits of our technology.
They are a technology, but it depends on the time scale. If we take 500 years or 1,000 years and we're sort of stuck here and we're just slowly stagnating, that's going to look dramatically different than if inexplicably to us now we discover within the next 50 or 100 some way to get off. Like the trajectory of everything is going to be completely different. You get my point, I think.
I get your point. I mean, but that's why I don't find it to be speculative fiction on this one. I mean, right now on Mars, they were pulling oxygen using robotics to do so.
Yeah.
Meaning they were using just the technology that we have available right now to do a proof of concept of showing, yes, we can pull this in order to make these other minerals and everything else, either for asteroids or for astronauts or for whatever.
Exactly.
I guess my point is, it's not speculative fiction. It's like we have the technology today. I think the issue is probably how much does it cost benefit of ratio, that type of stuff. I think it's the monetary mechanics.
Maybe. Well, when it comes to the asteroid mining specifically, because it's like you have to, once it's like with fusion reactors.
Yeah.
Once you reach a certain threshold of efficiency, it starts to make more sense. And if you compound that, once you break that threshold, then it starts to make a lot more sense at a certain point. You can just kind of keep doubling down or whatever on that. Well, let's close this out if you're done.
Yeah, let's close it. I guess my fight on this one is it's not speculative fiction. It's something that we're doing.
Yeah. And I don't mean to I still feel like technically it is, but it's also, you could also say it's just futurism or expecting,
it's just
trying
so
to anticipate.
Close in the way it's like talking about automation on Earth, saying, okay, at some point, in 10 years, they're going to have automated cars that they're not going to need people to drive those cars.
Yeah.
It's like, can we see it? Yes. Is the technology there now? Yes. Is it done? No. It's that. That's why I said don't consider it.
It's true, but I'm also reminded of this quote. It's hard enough to understand the future, let alone the present. You know what I mean?
Right.
I mean, pardon me. Hard enough to understand the present, let alone the future. It takes a lot of time just to get what the heck is going on right now, let alone in the past. But that's all you have hope of doing.
We're pretty good at.
But let's close this out.
Yeah.
You guys have been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming back in our soapbox segment with Jamarl's monologue and a short back and forth. And I mean short. We'll be right back.
Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM at 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So yesterday, we had a great conversation with Kim Iverson, and it was on this notion of vaccinations and everything else, and I left that conversation feeling uneasy. And it wasn't so much that I thought it went poorly. I thought the conversation in the show went relatively okay yesterday, but I still left the conversation feeling off about the way the conversation went, and I couldn't necessarily put my finger on it. In the comic books, there's a fight between Nick Fury and the Avengers, and this shouldn't necessarily be a fight, but Nick Fury always has secrets, and Nick Fury knows things. And despite not necessarily having powers, Nick Fury was able to hold his own with the Avengers, even Thor. And he whispers in Thor's ear, and Thor becomes unworthy and drops his hammer. no longer able to lift his hammer. What did he whisper in Thor's ear? What's more important, though, is that he made him lose confidence. And during the conversation with Kim, it was that. How do you have a fight with somebody when the person says something where you have to honestly engage than you had necessarily engaged prior? This notion, are you in a bubble on this? Is the influence of media not as wide-reaching? And because you are in a political space and you're looking at this stuff through a very specific political lens, that you are giving more due to it than it's deserved. Yesterday, I was looking at the stats, and it's astonishing in regards to the risk of either not getting vaccinated, not doing the mask, all of that stuff. The numbers are astonishing, and the numbers are growing. We were at 5,000 people dropping dead. 600,000 people right now have dropped dead. Over 30 million people have been infected. And these are people, significant numbers, are going to have downstream effects. Let's say 27% of the population in this country represent Republicans. And let's say within the context of that, you have a large number of those people who tend to be more skeptical than, let's say, Democrats on this stuff. And let's even just take out the science stuff. Let's take just the very specifics of it all. What does 27% of 300 million people look like? Those numbers start to get crazy when you start to think of the number of the people who are, let's say, not in the belief set of either the vaccine, are hesitant about it, or, for that matter, don't buy into the COVID issue at all. And between those things, as I was making the point yesterday, one of the networks seemed to have more people on that network that seem to be either against the vaccines, skeptical of the vaccines, or not necessarily giving due diligence to COVID. I mean, when I played the clip, I think the day before, of people applauding at CPAC of the United States not getting vaccinated, that is decidedly one party taking that choice. And I understand Glenn Greenwald made the point about the Democrats taking this particular tack early on when Trump was doing warp speed. There was a slight difference in that where it looked like Trump was trying to force these guys to put something out sooner than what it was. But beyond that, besides the point, right now, there's a skepticism within one segment of the population that seems to be a lot more than the other. It's not just me. And no, it's not just me being in a bubble. There is decidedly a skew. And just to make the point that much more clear on how dangerous this is, during June, every person who died of COVID-19 in Maryland was unvaccinated, according to the spokespersons for the governor's office. There were 130 people who died of COVID in Maryland in June, according to the Centers for Disease Control. New COVID-19 vaccines and hospitalizations were also predominantly among unvaccinated people, the stat 95% and 93%, respectively. In Louisiana, 97% of the state's COVID-19 cases and deaths since February have been in unvaccinated people. Governor John Bel Edwards said Friday, between February and July, unvaccinated people in Louisiana was 20 times more likely to become infected with COVID-19 during the state's health department. In Alabama, over 96% of COVID-19 deaths in April 1st were in unvaccinated people. The state's health department said on July 13th, for 509 deaths out of 529, over 42% of adults in the state are vaccinated. That's not enough. In Los Angeles County, nearly every COVID-19 case, hospitalization, and death is in the unvaccinated people. Los Angeles County Department of Health, Public Health, July 12th. Of the 1,059 new cases reported that day, nearly 87% of the people were under the age of 50. Quote, the COVID-19 vaccines are the most effective and important tool to reduce COVID-19 transmission and the spread of variants like the highly transmissible Delta variant, Public Health Director Barbara Ferrer said in a statement. New York Health Commissioner Dr. David Chosky said vaccines are, quote, astonishingly effective, unquote, while sharing that over 98% of COVID-19 hospitalizations and deaths in the city between January 1st and June 15th were in people who were not fully vaccinated. That includes 8,069 deaths in people who were not fully vaccinated. The point that I'm trying to make to you is that the vaccinations make a difference, not just in whether or not you get COVID, but also in whether or not you die from COVID. There's a big difference, and you can see that difference in the skew and in the numbers in and of themselves. So, if one of the networks is arguing contrary or is creating a framework and a context, or one of the political parties creating a context and a framework that goes against what the numbers are saying, then they are killing their audience. It seems to be more straightforward as straightforward could be. And to make that point clear that it's not just me saying it. It's not just the Washington Post saying it. It's not just all of these other networks that are basically pointing out that Fox News seems to be trying to kill their audience. You can hear it for yourself. I've shown the clips. Laura Ingraham, Sean Hannity, Tucker Carlson. These guys have been pushing against the vaccines. It's utterly astonishing.
I remember in the Hannity clip that you sent over earlier, Hannity at the end says he's pro-vaccine.
Right. Hannity comes out in that clip and says, yeah, we're not going to have time. We maybe play it later. But Hannity comes out in this wild clip that says, I am pro-vaccines, go talk to your doctor, etc. Now, in the show, apparently he was going after vaccines. He was putting it down and everything else. But in that clip, he did that. Why? Because he was getting so much pressure and that the network was getting hit so much. I've even played Hannity clips where Hannity was like dodging or attacking the vaccine and everything else. These guys are getting pressure. And that's kind of my point in this. The reason why I pulled that clip is because it gets across. You never have to say that if you weren't saying something contrary prior. The pressure that Hannity got and Hannity was getting, Hannity came out and basically made this video of go to see your vaccines, go see your doctors, and blah, 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 blah.
Because he's having to run defense for himself or whatever.
Exactly.
Watch his own.
It's that.
His own six.
It's that. And I want to point out how sad that is. When you have a clear case where you can look at the data and the numbers yourself. And here's my basic point in this. Media does matter in influence, even if it's not the totality of the influence. The people who are family and who are friends. So Kaiser did a study on this, and one of the things from the behavioral trends, in one point, Kim was right, that it's not entirely what the people are saying in the media that are driving people one way or the other. The media could actually just be reflecting what those people think in the first place. The thing that had impact and influence, the people who were already skeptical of it in the beginning remained skeptical of it going out. Those people were influenced. 1/5 of adults, 21%, now report being vaccinated after saying in January that they were planning on waiting to get vaccinated, would only get it if required, or would definitely not get vaccinated. Many of these individuals noted that the role of their friends and family members, as well as their personal doctors, in persuading them to get the vaccines. Seeing their friends and family members get vaccinated without serious side effects, talking to family members about being safely visits, being able to safely visit them, conversations with their personal doctors about their risk, all persuasive factors for these individuals. A small but meaningful share also said that easing restrictions of the vaccinated people was a factor in the decision to get vaccinated. So a few things here. The Biden administration is not doing this correctly. You need to look at the data here. The people who are saying that I am not going to get vaccinated were persuaded by other family members and friends more than anything else. And those family members and friends who was like, hey, I got vaccinated, I feel okay, it was safe, I can visit, etc. That became a more persuasive argument than pretty much anything else. And only 5% were able to come just because it's like, okay, the government is opening up things, and it's like, that was only 5%, meaning it was only a small number. The highest number was, hey, I got this, I'm feeling okay about it. Friends, families, relatives, connections. Meaning, if media is putting out a particular story, that story will have influence on some way because it's media, right? And within the context of that influence, having something that bolsters somebody's opinion, emboldens them not to get the vaccine. By the same token, it also, in cases where it's telling people, look, this is the reality of it, talk to your doctor, et cetera, that would also have a contrary effect of getting some people, whatever the probability is, to get those vaccines. I guess my point is, it was more of an influence to have the people, family, relatives, and friends to talk to those people to get them to get on board.
Well, and that means that social media isn't as impactful, doesn't it?
But social media is fans, friends, relatives, family, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, but you'd still have that without the social media. It's not like by introducing social media, you suddenly introduced disinformation to the family network. People would still, and this is almost, if you had a full, we should play close.
Yeah.
But if you had a full list of people, which you wouldn't get without getting a bunch of privacy rights violations and everything, you don't. I'm skeptical of like having a census of the medical records of the entire population. I'll put it like that. But I get why people push for it, because if you had it, you would then have the ability to do a sort of sociological network analysis and be like, okay, are the networks of unvaccinated people familial networks, friend networks? Are there a lot of individuals who pay attention to high profile social media posts from quote unquote misinformers or whatever? You get my point. Yeah. You would actually know that stuff. Right now we don't. But that sort of would support Kim's argument a little bit more. That we're in a bubble. That people are just. They don't want to take the vaccine. The government hasn't made its case to them. It's not that they're being bamboozled by Alex Jones It's that Biden hasn't said clearly enough how exactly the variants are going to relate to the vaccines and how the vaccines are going to help in the long term, not just right now.
Differently. I took this as social media networks does have impact. I mean, social media is friends, families, relatives, the connections that you make and everything else.
Those are just your social networks. The
social networks.
Yes, social media, what that seems to introduce is the possibility of sudden new one-to-many relationships, by which I mean influencers. If it's your friends and your family that you're talking to, you talk to them, hopefully, without Facebook or Twitter or whatever.
I know, I'm making the point that it bolsters the political opinions of the people who are there.
The influencers, of the influencers.
Influencers.
Yes. Yeah.
Meaning, in the same way that Hannity would put out a particular political opinion, or Fox News puts out political opinion, it bolsters those people for their position saying, it's what is it, cognitive bias or something like that, or confirmation bias in regards to the way it works. But it's not necessarily changing their minds as an absolute, if that makes sense.
I started to push back. You down to come back to this a little bit later?
Yeah. We can have a conversation about this later because we can't talk about it fully. But no, I guess my point is, yes, of course, the Hannitys of the world are going to have an influence. The Fox News of the world is going to have an influence. But it seems that the way Biden is cutting this argument is not entirely correct to get the biggest bang for his buck and trying to get people convinced. I think it's that. I don't think Kim is right. I don't buy her argument. But I do think there's another way of putting this where they could do this far more effective than what they're doing, as opposed to just, we're going to stop social media from doing.
She put you on your heels, Jamarl, and that's why she's an excellent foil.
She's a great guest. I love her as a guest. Because she made me think about it. I was sitting at home like, am I in a bubble on this? Is she right about this?
Called me up at 3 in the morning.
I know, like, Shane, I think I understand what's going on.
It was more like 4 p.m.
But you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll come back to it. I'm pretty sure we're going to get a lot of calls on this one. And we will be back in a moment with Shoban Saxena talking about basically the Pegasus and the RSO group, the Iranian Israeli private firm. Back in a moment. This is going to be a great conversation.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Yesterday, a massive story dropped dealing with RSO Group. It's an Israeli-backed firm, or Israeli private firm in Israel, that was basically mercenaries or cyber mercenaries for hire. They would use this kind of spear phishing, and some of this stuff was even more technical than spear phishing because you didn't even have to click on the link in some of the cases for them to infect your phone. And governments around the world would pay for these guys to infect phones of journalists or of politicians or people or executives. And in the infection of the phone, you would be able to pull all the information that is on the phone. You would be able to turn on the mic and the camera. In one case, they framed or got salacious information on a journalist. I believe this was an Azerbaijan case. And basically, governments around the world would use these guys. And like I said, they would get sources of journalists. They would get all the information that were on journalists' phones. And now the Israeli government, who basically had to approve of this, if you read the Washington Post article, because this is considered a weapon of sorts, they are, the company, or let's go to the company for a moment, have basically said they're blameless in this. That we have rigorous standards. We have no way to know what the governments are doing when they get the product and everything else.
No, well, they say they do know. They say they vet it. They say that they individually vet cases.
Well, they're saying two different things then. Because in one part, they're saying they're not responsible for the way the governments use the product. But on the other part, that they vet the governments. It is a wild story, to put it mildly. If you disagree with that, Shane, tell me. I mean, that was the way I read it.
We can get into it in the conversation. We can go over the facts.
Let's bring in Shoban Saxena. Shoban Saxena is a Sao Paulo-based journalist reporting on trade, culture, music, and of course, football. Despite an interest in international issues, human rights, and politics, Saxena's previous position as editor with the Sunday Times of India and in his current journalism in Brazil, his work seeks to capture a slice of the colorful and often overlooked lives of regular people in the countries of interest. He has worked with the Times of India, the Indian Express, the Hindu. He is currently a contributor to The Wire and the Brazil Wire, and that's what brings him here. Because one of the people that were on the list, one of the phone numbers, was the person who started The Wire. Shoban, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Jamal. Good morning, Shane. Good to be on your show again. Thank you very much.
Was there anything that I said in my explanation of this, just as an intro, that was off or that you want to add to before we start?
It is you said correctly. It's a very, very scary situation. Imagine governments around the world, and especially in case of India, because it's a very big story in India right now. The government is using a software which no one knows which agency is using it. They're hacking into. This is not surveillance, mind you. This is pure hacking. Because they're installing a software inside your phone. They can activate your microphone. They can activate your video, your camera. They can steal all the information. They can get all your contacts, your bank accounts, everything. So it's a very, very scary situation for journalists. As you mentioned, the two founding editors of The Wire, Siddharth Vadrajan, M.K. Venu, they're on the list. Two more journalists of The Wire who have been working there or have worked in the past on the list, and more than 40 Indian journalists are on the list who are being snooped, plus many activists, environmental activists, Supreme Court judge, politicians from opposition parties. So it's a kind of 360-degree surveillance and hacking of people who may be doing some work which is not very comfortable to the government. So this is not just a violation. We can't say it's a violation of their privacy. It's much more than that. I mean, it's a complete violation of the liberty, the freedom, and the freedom to work as journalists. This is a very, very serious situation. And nobody knows. The government has not said, government has not accepted which agency is using this, how they got this software, who's accountable to it. And we have a situation where people's life can be under threat, and all the information, their private information, their professional information, government has access to. Very scary situation and very scary for democracy in India.
And another side of this, a couple of interesting things. For one thing, they can't target U.S.-based phones from what they have said. In other words, any phone, even if it's a foreign phone that's operating inside the United States, or if it just starts with the one, our international code, you can't target it. They say it is technologically impossible, which I will note, and I want to come back to because it's interesting. It's a special privilege that America has, apparently, where we're immune to whatever tactics they're using here.
That's so weird.
Just a very weird thing that I want to come back to. And
such a quirk.
We have time. But what if you mentioned the two people? This is The Wire India, right, Shaban?
Yes. Yeah.
How from what you've seen from the reporting on this, how have these breaches of people's phones been used in terms of collecting private data, tracking their locations? I've seen some reports of people, associated with people who were hacked, being killed, those kinds of things. That's obviously much more beyond the pale. That's a much further degree of horrible, corrupt behavior by a government, killing somebody. But my point is, what have we seen in terms of the evidence of how this practice has been used by governments and agencies around the world? Shaban.
Yeah, I think as I'm talking to you, news is coming from India that the government in the southern state of Karnataka, a very big state, was toppled 2 years ago because of the information the government could get from the phones of opposition leaders. So this is not just the hacking of phones; it's actually hacking of elected government.
This is like a state government, a region of India, or a state of India that the local government was toppled using this tool.
South of India, the capital is Bangalore, which is known as the Silicon Valley of India. Mm-hmm. It's a very, very important state, and the government, unlike the U.S., where you have a federal system, I think in India the federal government is very powerful. It can actually dismiss state governments. It plays a very important role in the state government. But this government was toppled. Horse trading happened. A lot of dirty things happened. And now it's coming to light that all this was done because this Pegasus software was used to snoop on the opposition, politicians from opposition parties. Wow. All the information gathered, and the government will stop it. So this is and another important fact which has come to light is there's a person called Prashant Kishore who runs a political consultancy service in India. He helps opposition parties and other parties in preparing their election strategies. He's a very, very important person. His phone was also under surveillance. His phone was hacked twice, actually. So it is a case of the government trying to get all the information about the political strategies, election strategies, campaign of opposition parties. So you're not just getting information from someone's phone, you're actually getting the entire strategies of political parties.
Yep.
So you can manipulate elections. So this is not just the hacking of phones. As I said before, this is actually hacking of democracy.
And here's another side of it. Jamarl, you and I were having a conversation yesterday. Think about the United States hiring out BlackRock in Iraq. We hire out this mercenary group. Pardon me, Blackwater. Not the investment group. Thank you. They hire out Blackwater in Iraq. This outside mercenary group, deadly, violent, broadly in ill repute around the world, at least from the public's perspective. But we lean on them. In the same way, these governments are leaning on these weird cyber mercenarial organizations, specifically the NSO group, which even though it lauds itself as standing up the only group of its kind to protect human rights and to only pursue terrorists and serious criminals, that's what they say.
Life-saving mission, Shane.
What'd you say?
Life-saving mission is the way they put it.
Exactly. That's how they put this. So they're using the poison daggers or whatever that they've confiscated from the enemy. In other words, they're using these black hat tools, zero-day exploits, to hack into whoever they can effectively, and they're selling the service to countries. This is a sort of cyber mercenarial organization. And when you're talking about an attack on democracy, who is this being used on? By governments against their own citizens. Specifically, if you're targeting journalists, what are you trying to target? Them covering your certain stories. You don't want them talking about some stuff. And so that's in the same way that propaganda is the cudgel of democracy. This is like the garrote wire or something like that. This is the thing that silently keeps certain stories out of circulation. Shaban, we got to a little bit late, but nevertheless, I want to take just a short break. We're going to keep on. Oh, you want to stay with them? All right, let's stay with them. I got to get Jamarl shaking his head at me. Let's keep with you. Getting back into this, any sign so far that the Israeli government specifically didn't just condone this, but at least technology is more deeply connected and still, you get my question. Are they involved really deeply in NSO group from any of this reporting? Can we see that? Shaban?
Yeah, I think I've just seen a report in The Guardian that says this company, NSO, has very close relations with the Israeli government. And as per the statement from the NSO itself, they sell this software only to governments or agency after vetting them and after clearance from the Israeli government. So, of course, the Israeli government is hand in glove, if not have some kind of partnership with this company. This is, you mentioned the word mercenary, cyber mercenary. So it is a cyber mercenary operation being run in 55 countries with the approval of the Israeli government. This is a very, very serious situation. Israel or any company, they can't wash their hands of saying, we're just selling the software. Someone must be maintaining the software. Someone must be updating the software. So, of course, there's some kind of data center in Israel or wherever the headquarters of this company is. So Israel has access to all the data in that sense.
And let's
this
be clear.
Is much more than a...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
I'm sorry. No, I was going to say, I was going to agree with you for one and say that, yes. I mean, I think I don't think it's a leap of logic to say that if Israel is basically saying, yes, we allow X or Y to take place in the various countries, that there may be either a backdoor to the information, that they may be able to see or know what that information is on some kind of level. I mean, I don't think this is any different than, let's say you have your own intelligence services, but there are certain things that you don't necessarily want your intelligence services doing that are more grimy. And so you develop this kind of civilian contractor that can do similar functions or similar services. Also, let's be very clear on the effectiveness of this. The ability to know what your opposition is doing, the ability to listen in by turning on mics or cameras in regards to listening what your opposition is doing, to be able to get dirty information on journalists so you can either embarrass or blackmail. I mean, the powers of this are astonishing. And like you said, this is not a governmental function stuff. This is just black mercenary projects that are being used. One of the interesting things, though, the Israeli government hasn't been implicated in this in the way that they would implicate, let's say, China or Russia in something similar. Have you noticed that? Like, it's an Israeli... Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, Israel gets away with everything. I'm sorry to say that. I mean, this software was sold to Saudi Arabia in a $55 million deal.
Yeah.
Now, an Israeli company selling this software or anything related to defense or cyber weaponry to Saudi Arabia is not possible without the clearance of the Israeli government.
Exactly.
It's just in logic, yeah, exactly. And also, I mean, we know that there's a very close relationship between the defense industry in Israel and the former Israeli officers from Mossad or other agencies. They all in it together. So this is actually, I mean, I'm not suggesting it is, but it looks like it's some kind of front for the Israeli government. And Israel has been using its defense industry to promote diplomacy. Israel doesn't have good relations with majority of the countries across the world. But suddenly they found they're making drones, they're making missiles, they're making this kind of cyber snooping software and trying to win friends through business. Because in Israel, the Mossad has established its position as some kind of a super intelligence agency which can do anything. And they're marketing it very well here, actually. And exactly doing that, I don't know what is the state of democracy in Israel, but now seeing Israel is exporting of software which can hack democracy, can hack media establishment, and can hack activists who are working on crucial issues. This is a very serious situation, and the buck here stops with the Israeli government.
And let's also be clear from the standpoint of hacking democracy and activists. I mean, if you are in Brazil, if you're in Mexico, if you're in Saudi Arabia, your life is on the line, and all of your sources that are actually trying to report on various stories and everything else, also your life is on the line. Like, this is not, I mean, you have people who are killed, activists who don't necessarily have this, let's say, huge profile, massive name recognition, that governments or various governments might be interested in figuring out who they are so those people can get killed. I mean, we've had people in Mexico or Brazil, for that matter, killed in these situations. I mean, how do you feel about this as a journalist yourself covering this? I mean, does it put a chilling effect on you and what you write, on the way you think about whether or not you're being recorded in the various countries because you are covering certain topics?
Or just even sources,
yeah,
communicating with sources, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, Jamal, Shane, we journalists work with sources. For sources are very important for us. And we do everything possible to protect our sources. We don't reveal their identity. We take care that they don't come into the light. But here is a situation that the government knows beforehand who your sources are. They also know beforehand what kind of story is going to come out so they can prepare themselves, Even before your readers, even before your editor gets a story, a government agency will have access to it. They'll know in advance everything about it. So it can definitely put the source at risk. It can also put at risk the people who are going to be mentioned in the story. It also gives government, a very big advantage against the journalist.
Yes, yes. I want to talk about that for a second. I'm sorry for cutting in, Shaban, but there was something that had been floating around in my mind too. Governments can and not just spoil it, and they can't just spoil sources. They don't just get inside access to that. They also get the first mover advantage in responding to stories they see journalists working on. If they're targeting little known, people, there's nevertheless probably a good reason. They're probably not just trying to broadcast their coverage or whatever. Their reception of this data that they're intercepting on people's phones. They're trying to target individuals who they see as a particular threat. And whether that's tracking them after they've published a big story or watching their work, watching what they're working on now, you're far better able to prepare for it, whether it's PR, optics, or just, nipping it in the bud, so to speak, by whatever means with that journalist. The government, in other words, has the first mover advantage. I don't see there being an exact precedent for this. In other words, if I look in the last couple of centuries even, height of technological progress in the 20th century until very recently, the worst authoritarian government would have had to tap so many phones, would have had to go to such great lengths to get what appears to be easy and almost automatic now, where you can send a link to somebody's phone without even clicking on the link. Just by receiving the text, people's phones get breached, and suddenly you have this immediate level of monitoring. The unprecedented nature of this, Shaban, how do you, Jamarl was talking about the chilling effect. How do you think, I don't just mean specifically, is this going to, is this an existential threat to good journalism? What are the limits of this? in your eyes?
Yeah, it is. It seems like we are all living inside a matrix. When the Edward Snowden documents came out, we knew that the U.S. agency NSA was spying on everyone, and other governments might also be doing it. But this revelation takes it to another level. This is like that film Minority Report, Tom Cruise film, where the government agents is trying to stop a crime before it is committed. Here we have a situation, you're trying to stop people from doing their journalism. You're trying to stop activists from doing their work. You're trying to stop opposition parties, political parties from doing campaign, because you have all the advantage, everything about them. It's not just you have the information, you can manipulate that information. You can put people's lives at risk. So this is a very, very scary situation. Of course, most of the journalists, I think, we all work with that knowledge. The government is snooping on us. They're trying to read our emails. They're trying to read our social media accounts. They're trying to listen to a conversation. So we work with this information.
Yeah, but this is different. Because it's like they were making the argument that all of the things that like Signal or some of the apps that they may use in order for protection just don't work. Because the moment that you open up the message on your phone, well, at this point, the app is already there. Like it's the information at that point, everything on the phone is accessible. So it's like, even though, let's say, for example, they talk about the cat and mouse game between Apple and, let's say, agencies like these kind of black agencies, and how, Apple, like the moment that Apple made a change, within a few minutes, they had already adapted to the change that Apple made in order to get around it. Like that's astonishing. Meaning journalists are not safe in the way that it goes. And to be honest, I'm more curious about what are the effects going to be. So Amazon Web Services shut down the infrastructure of accounts linked to Israeli surveillance vendor NSO Group, Amazon said in a statement. Now, you mentioned the effect that this is having in India. I would imagine this is going to have certain effects in Mexico, considering the number of people who are under surveillance in Mexico. I think they were the largest number. And the Modi government. Like you said, the Modi government. So what is going to be the effect of this going forward? Is there going to be legislation? Does there need to be some kind of world legislation to ensure that stuff like this doesn't necessarily happen? Should companies like this be allowed to persist and operate? And if not, what about the NSA? Meaning, this capability of this company is basically the NSA, right? The moment that a company, let's say Saudi Arabia says, I want to use your product. Great. And Saudi Arabia at this point, it's the rightful government, if you want to call it that, extends credibility to use of this when it goes after whoever it goes after, whether that's the wife of Khashoggi or the woman who wanted to marry Khashoggi, whether that's some of the other journalists. So should companies like this exist in and of themselves? And if not, what about the NSA? And what is going to be the main effect of this going forward? I think you mentioned India, so let's do with India. Are there going to be effects on this in India? That's too many questions. I apologize.
One scary information that has come out that this software can also be used for planting evidence in your phone. There has been cases, some human rights activists in India who work with the tribal people. Files were planted on the laptops, on their phones, and then they were implicated and they have been sent to jail. So using this software, the government can plant something on your phone. They can send messages to people on your behalf and you wouldn't even know. So this has a serious legal implications. Of course, also there's a lot of accountability. When these Apple phones are launched by these demigods of tech industry, Tim Cook and all these people, they say this is these phones are like God's gift to humanity. And we know these phones are nothing. They're being used to spy on yourself. Even the tech companies, whether it's Android phones and iPhones, they have a lot to answer. How are they producing phones which can be hacked so easily by a private company sitting in one corner of the world? There are a lot of questions there. Of course, there has to be legislation. These companies need to be banned. Not just banned, I think they should be held accountable for what they have done, for the not violation of privacy and freedom, for the hacking of democracy.
You're talking an NSO group specifically there.
Yes.
Yeah, well, it needs to be extirpated. This is the thing, Jamarl, you're talking about whether or not this kind of company should exist. The government has the legitimate use of force. That's the thing that the bare sort of sine qua non or something like that, the bare necessity for what you'd have to have a government. And then they do that. And so if you had, vigilante police groups, well, you did for a while, it was the Wild West, and then we got rid of those. You have a cyber criminal group that's operating for governments. It's a criminal group. They're using advanced malware hacking techniques. The fact that they're targeting terrorists doesn't change the nature of the tools that you're using. It only changes the level of justification for using them based on, who you're targeting with them. Absolutely, it needs to be fined. It needs to be gotten rid of. This should not be tolerated by the Israeli government. It should not be tolerated by the American government and any governments pursuing these kinds of things. If you're going to levy sanctions, maybe consider levying sanctions on countries, if you're going to do it, on ones that are targeting their own journalists using tools like this. But I'm not even necessarily in favor of that. But if you're going to do it, I think you might get my point, Jamarl. But I'm not advocating that. Anyway, Shaban Saxena, thank you for joining us. We're out of time now. Shaban Saxena is a journalist based in Sao Paulo, working with the Times of India, Indian Express, and The Hindu. Currently a contributor to The Wire India. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute with headlines.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I'm your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That would strongly imply that you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Shane and I are sitting here arguing over sovereign use of force.
should the NSA or the CIA be allowed to do this?
So the question that we hit upon is, if it's wrong for a private entity to do something like this, okay. Well, we had private mercenaries that were working on behalf of the U.S. government to go into other countries, let's say like Iraq or let's say in some of the other countries, and we would pay them. And because of what they were doing was basically on behalf of the government, it's like we're paying a private company to do the job that our particular military soldiers would do. Well, how is this any different? You have private company who is basically serving a faculty that those countries don't have. So they made a reference to Edward Snowden, that when Edward Snowden and the leaks came out, other companies realized how far in the rears they were in comparison to the United States.
The UK, Canada,
exactly,
New
all
Zealand,
of those
Australia, the Five A's.
They were in the rears
specifically.
And so those countries said, okay, we need to up our game. Well, what if you don't have that infrastructure yourself? A private company says, hey, you want that faculty of the NSAC? Right here, we're the people.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're
talking about. So is it any different? Saudi Arabia, rightful government, Azerbaijan, rightful government, all these rightful governments, and they say, okay, we want to use your hacking tool. And just like a person buying a gun, they say, okay, fair enough, but you have certain responsibilities associated with it. It's like, hey, we're honest actors. You can trust us. And then they go and do the most despicable things in the world with the software.
Yeah.
Well, how is it any different than, let's say, the U.S. using the NSA? It's just contracting out the same service.
I hear you, and I think a lot of Americans...
I'm not making an argument, I'm just asking a question.
Americans agree broadly, I think, that the NSA shouldn't be allowed to do the warrantless wiretapping stuff that Edward Snowden disclosed that it did, and that we can all presume it continues to do on whatever basis, whether it's limited or broadened compared to what Snowden disclosed. But the point is, a lot of Americans think NSA shouldn't do that. So, wait, should we allow this independent company based in Israel to work with governments around the world to do it? No. I don't think anybody accepts that. This is why this story is pretty easily getting traction. But we'll see if it does anything or changes anything. I think the fact that here's another side of the Americans
wait, real quick. Do you think Americans are against wiretapping either at home, or do you think they're against wiretapping abroad? Because I think Americans would agree with the NSA and the CIA's functions abroad. I don't think they're like I'm here.
I'm talking about domestic stuff.
Yeah.
Any country, okay, if we're going to talk about spying overseas, then we're talking about spying.
Yes.
If we're talking about domestic wiretapping where you're targeting your own citizens, or you're working with the UK, okay, we'll tap your citizens, you tap ours.
Right.
Somehow that won't be illegal.
But you get my point. The moment that another country finds out that the U.S. has this fake faculty, what are they to do? I mean, don't they want that faculty also? The answer is yeah, of course those countries want it, especially despotic countries.
Of course.
They're going to want that faculty.
It's a sign of weakness, and if it is connected to the Israeli government, it's just going to be feeding them. It's just going to be bottom feeding or whatever information that they're sucking up on, and like we were talking about too, the Israeli government would know not just the information that any country knows about, okay, the journalist, they'd also know who's targeting the journalists, which is another layer of either blackmail or just information that they could run on.
Because I don't believe for a moment that the Israeli government is up. Just from... I don't believe that they're separate and distinct in this.
Here's one thing that I wanted to come back to, because I kind of set this up and we didn't hit it, I realized, in the last segment. The The fact that Americans are excluded technologically somehow from being targeted by this service, which is what a spokesperson from the company said. It's technologically impossible to target either foreign phones operating inside the United States or American phones with the international country code 1 for operating overseas. If you think about that from an American's perspective, that probably means we're going to care about this story a bit less.
Yes.
In other words,
right, because we're not personally held.
You can't be affected by it.
Yes,
which is, I don't know.
How weird is that? That just seems so weird to me.
It does. Yeah. What's the explanation there?
Well, special relationship,
special privilege. That whole kind of
special relationship. Hey, we'll turn a blind eye to this, but we better not show up on this. Because imagine if you're an American politician. What are your thoughts on that? And does America know that Israel had this faculty in the first place? Did America, on some cases, use the faculty if they needed that faculty?
Well, if that comes out, that would be huge. But if we didn't know, then can we really be that competent? I would have to assume we did. I mean, we know because we've been talking about NSO Group. This has been known for years.
2016 at the very least.
Now. Yeah, this was first reported 4 or 5 years ago. It's just that this newest report is by, I think it was 16 different organizations across many different countries and 50,000,
names or numbers that were on that list.
Exactly. It's the size and extent of it.
Yeah. And then when they were able to check the phones, because what ended up happening, they were bringing the phones for the people to check the phones. And they would find either attacks that were successful,
attempted attacks,
et cetera, et cetera. So it's pretty wild, fascinating story, and definitely something that is going to be in the news for a while. So let's go to headlines. Let's keep moving. About 55,828 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday, and there were about 622 new deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of about 35,035 cases per day, an increase of 198% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 49% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 56% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 34,097,758 people across the United States and has killed 608,811 unfortunate human beings in the United States. New COVID cases and hospitalizations in the United States are predominantly among the unvaccinated, with 95% of the cases and 93% of the hospitalizations among those who haven't received a vaccine. In Louisiana, 97% of the state's cases and deaths since February have been from the unvaccinated. I went through that list a little bit earlier this morning in the monologue, and yeah, it's something that people should pay attention to. A report released today estimates that India's deaths during the coronavirus pandemic are 10 times the official total, with the total excess deaths standing somewhere near 3 million and 4.7 million. Although these will not all likely be from the coronavirus, it is a strong indication that there are more than have been officially confirmed. Donald Trump predicted that TV ratings or news ratings would slump following his departure from the Oval Office, and so far, he isn't wrong. He isn't wrong. Since a sharp jump in January following the election, January 6th, ratings for both primetime news and newspapers, including the New York Times, have consistently slumped compared to where they were last year. CNN is most deeply affected among TV news outlets as primetime audience has dropped 45% in the last few weeks. Wow, that's astonishing. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has announced plans to float the $1.2 trillion infrastructure in the Senate with a vote set for tomorrow. Schumer is trying to focus minds, and he doesn't necessarily believe that people would get on it if he's not setting a deadline. We'll see what happens. A rioter from January 6 Capitol breach has been given an 8-month prison sentence for his felony. A crane manager from Florida who breached the Capitol has been given the first punishment of all of the rioters and will serve as the precedent for the punishment of others. Peru is set to declare Pedro Castillo as the new president over Keiko Fujimori. The official announcement will be sometime next week, but the National Jury of Elections has announced Castillo beat Fujimori by 44,058 votes. If you remember, Keiko was going with this argument that it was fraud. That seems to be the new thing for elections now, but those fraud complaints were basically pushed to the side.
Didn't work for Trump.
Nope.
Probably won't work for Bolsonaro.
No, I don't know. I mean, it depends on how much power Bolsonaro has in that country. I mean, if you remember, the first time around, he threatened the judiciary to get Lula put in prison in the first place. And so it's like, how much does the military brass have sway now after all of this?
But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it will work for Trump. Maybe it will just help him get reelected is the thing. We'll see.
Yeah, that would be terrifying. I mean, because at that point, up is down, left is right. It's. I don't think I would be so bothered if it wasn't for how he's running and what he's running on. This notion that it was all a lie, Biden is not really the president. It's really. We can talk about it in a few. Haiti's acting Prime Minister Claude Joseph stepped down and is being replaced by Ariel Henry. These changes following the assassination of former Haitian President Jovenel Moise 13 days ago. It is unclear what is going to happen in Haiti. There are going to be protests. There seems to be a huge amount of conflict at this point, and this is going to be wait and see. We have Danny Shaw coming on a little bit later to discuss, so this is going to be a really good conversation. A major report released this weekend about forbidden stories. The OCCRP, Citizens Lab, and over a dozen other organizations highlight the company NSO Group and its Pegasus malware service, through which dozens of governments and government-affiliated agents and agencies have targeted domestic dissidents for spying by using zero-day exploits to access their phones' most basic functions. Implicated in the use of Pegasus includes the governments of India, Azerbaijan, and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud. Amazon Web Services shut down servers used by the NSO Group following the widely publicized release. Now, this is what Shane and I were talking about in the beginning, and this is what we had a great conversation with Shoban Saxena about in the last segment. NFT market OpenSea hits a massive $1.5 billion valuation. The company stated that the biggest growth problem they have is due to infrastructure issues with Ethereum blockchain. And last, Jeff Bezos will be launching into space today at 9 a.m. Eastern, just in 41 minutes or so.
Oh,
49 minutes.
Exactly.
Thank you. 49 minutes. Now, I'm checking my math. This comes after Richard Branson beat former Amazon CEO to the U.S. legal definition of space at 86 kilometers. Bezos' Blue Origin flight is expected to go about 106 kilometers high. The Kármán line, usually or more universally believed to be the start of space, is set at 100 kilometers high. Bezos' flight also marks the first entirely civilian space crew with 100% autopilot flight sequences. Back home, 185,000 people have signed petitions to stop Bezos from returning to Earth. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Did you know they're taking an 82-year-old up into space with them?
Good for him.
And she apparently
good for her.
Wally Funk is had qualified, had basically passed the astronaut test back in, I think it was the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
I had this up just a couple of minutes ago. I was reading through this, and she passed it back then in 1961. She qualified. She didn't actually ever go up into space. Now she's 82 years old.
Good for her.
Good for her, but it's kind of a risky move. You know, I just
Life is risk. Life is risk. And at the point where you're 80-something years old, what is the average rate, or what is the death rate for in the United States, that age or whatever?
For women, it'd probably be around there within the next couple of years, I think.
No loss.
Oh, God, I don't know about that.
I would do it.
Certainly an adventure.
Let me ask you this: if an astronaut I forget the name of the movie, but the guy is like in space. He's not. Some people are saying he's not entirely uptight, and in his last thing, he's plummeting to the planet Mars, and he's like looking out the window. He's so ecstatic about this because in that moment, he's fulfilling whatever it is he needs to fulfill or wants to fulfill in that life, despite the fact that he's about to die in the process. If you are 80-something years old and you are fulfilling your dream of going into space and you have a heart attack, looking at Earth with your hand and face pressed against the window.
Really the worst way to go.
Is that a horrible way to go?
No, I hear you, and I can't disagree.
It's not that I'm undermining her life. It's not that. I'm affirming her life in some way.
It'd just be cool if she could come home and talk to her
of course,
kids or grandkids about it. You know,
right? I'm putting this hopefully as the worst case scenario, but in my head is pressed against the window, her eyes wide, as and that's the last moment, that type of stuff. I mean, it could be worse.
Oh,
I guess my thought is, if regardless of what your age is, life is risk in general, and there are things that you may want to do that you may take this kind of gamble, and I'm saying this from personal experience, right? You take this gamble of, I really want to accomplish this. I'm willing to accept all of this other stuff associated with it in order to try to do, because I don't think I'm going to die in the process, nor do I think she's going to die in the process.
I don't think she will. But
it's just
82 years old.
Yeah, it's impressive.
That would have to be the oldest Yes, the oldest person to have ever gone to space.
Wow.
Right under my eyes.
So she's going to break a
I'm like,
record. She's breaking a record.
There you go. Exactly. She's breaking that record.
Good for her, man. It's like, who was it? Was it George Bush Sr. when skydiving, when he hit like 80 or something like that?
Oh, did he do that?
Yeah, it was like, I forget the age that he hit, but he was way up there in age when he went skydiving. And people were like, oh my God, look at him. I am all board for that. Just because people get older doesn't necessarily mean, yes, they're more fragile. Yes, their bodies are, more pliable or something more breakable. But will, there's something to be said for will. And this notion of intent, and this is what I want to do, and this is what I'm willing to accept in order to accomplish X or Y. I applaud her.
Totally.
Good for her. That's phenomenal. We talked about the Pegasus thing and with Shoban Saxena. And yeah, I think it's a big deal. I'm stuck on this notion of, if we have an NSA, we have a CIA, we have these agencies that deal with spying constantly. And we have situations where these guys were unmasking Americans in regard to the spying, this kind of way and run around the spying in the country and everything else. And we accept as just a basis of operation that it is okay to spy on other countries around the globe. As Americans, we accept it, despite the fact that those countries would be like, whoa, how are you accepting that? Why is it okay for you to do that? So now you have this other company that basically allows foreign countries a similar faculty. If we say that this company shouldn't exist, how do we say this company shouldn't exist while leaving other countries with a similar faculty? That's what I'm stuck at. Because if people want to say, okay, well, you can make laws against this, fair enough. But if Saudi Arabia develops that in-house, does it make it any better? And the moment that you get away from that, isn't that kind of like the same argument of, well, wait a minute. I mean, you're basically saying that it's okay for the bigger governments to have this faculty, but the smaller governments are going to always be held at the whim. You know what I mean? It's that thing. It's almost like an arms race. The moment that you find that one country has the faculty, the other countries has it. It's like the OSS. For when the United States found out that Britain had this kind of massive spy network, the USSA was shocked by it. It was shocked that Britain was listening on U.S. communications. And the U.S. says, okay, well, we need to upgrade OSS. This is kind of where that stuff goes. It's the same thing. You put a weapon in space, then the country has to compensate. Isn't this the same thing? I get that people hate what this company is doing and what they've been using this stuff for. But if larger countries, let's say the UK or the US, have similar faculties, how can we say that this is how do we get rid of that?
I don't think that we necessarily need to, because I think that spying on other nations is kind of the standard, and it would be unreasonable to expect that we'll undo that. We've done that as long as there have been nations.
Memorial.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're trying to keep up tabs on what the other party's doing. What's different about the NSA revelations and what's different about this is that they're targeting their own domestic.
Right.
They're targeting their own citizens. They're targeting journalists. They're targeting dissidents. They're targeting anybody who could threaten through information or whatever, the status quo. And that would have the assumption is include some terrorists and some criminals and all that. But the point is those shouldn't be lumped into the same category as journalists, just who are doing their work and ideally even making those societies better places to live. This is a power grab.
Yes.
And it's a sign of weakness. The Five Eyes built up those agencies with many decades of effort. And when you say Saudi Arabia, if Saudi Arabia were to do that, not only do they have some skin in the game at that point, but putting in their own effort, arguably they would be held more accountable in whatever means we're going to use to hold Mohammed bin Salman accountable for this on the off chance that we do. You would, it seems to me, be far more able to hold them accountable for it. And maybe this argument doesn't make sense. I'm just throwing this out there. Feel free to disagree.
They chopped up Khashoggi.
They chopped up Khashoggi, but they had to use an outside service to do that. Now, if that had been Saudi Arabia's own intelligence service, we might have had a harder time figuring out that they did it. But if they did it, it would have been fully on their hands. Whereas in this case, they're using a mercenary group. It's this weird public-private partnership, cyber criminal thing going on.
I guess my thing is governments use private. I mean, think about Syria. The U.S. wants to, there's protests, all this other stuff going on in Syria. And we want to inflame that situation, but we don't want to put our troops in. We saw what Iraq did. It's a horrible mess. We can't get our troops out, et cetera, et cetera. So we decide, okay, fair enough. We're going to use mercenaries. I mean, meaning it's something that governments do. And it just seems like the only difference in this case is they just got caught. That seems to be the difference. Like, meaning, is this the only group in existence that's doing this? And the moment that you get rid of this group, are there going to be other groups that are just lining up saying, hey, we'll take over that particular service and that particular capability, because at this point, it's just a private enterprise serving at the whim of governments. Whether a government is doing it or whether they ferret it out to a private enterprise, I don't entirely see the huge difference. I know your point. If it's a private enterprise, you can hide that stuff in FOIA and everything else. But Saudi Arabia doesn't have a FOIA. They don't have to worry about that. I don't think Azerbaijan has a FOIA. So it's not like this notion that they had to hide, if that makes sense. They just don't have the faculty. This is just them reaching out. To
and what do we, again, if we sanction these countries for doing this, well, the NSA has done the same. So on this show, I would make the point very clearly, well, this isn't a good thing these other countries did, but we did it too. So are we going to slice off our own hand or whatever? We're going to find ourselves? That's the argument I would have to make.
Yeah.
But it's a weird argument because on some level, I get why countries do it. You shouldn't be doing it.
It makes sense. It's logical to do.
But you shouldn't be doing it to your own citizens. Again, that's my threshold.
But it's logical. But that they're going to do that, if you think about it.
And so what's the recourse? Are there any punishments it would make sense for us to levy? Because I think the answer is no, which means, like, you're right, it just carries forward into this, it becomes the new status quo. Governments occasionally do this thing when they have the resources, they create their own in-house intelligence community that is probably going to be better at it than this outsourced one,
Yeah,
and
especially when you have the resources of a government. Because these guys are just using phishing, spearheading, spyware, that type of stuff.
Yeah.
It's not like using the internal mechanics of the system like the U.S. was doing with the Snowden revelations.
Here's another way of looking at this. This is a sign of legitimate weakness. And this is also, you can even tie this into like the whole populism, elitism conversation or Brexit and all these other things.
And explain why you think this is weakness. And weakness in what aspect?
This is a sign of weakness on the part of these countries because they simply don't have the capacity to build their own IC. They couldn't build their own NSA. They had to lean on this one. And like I was saying in the conversation yesterday, it might seem a little bit of a weird argument to make, but this is kind of a tacky thing for these governments to do. Instead of having their own NSA, their own MI6, whatever, they have to lean on this kind of janky cyber criminal organization that uses zero-day exploits to like publicly fish access people's phones.
Yeah.
It's not the NSA using like prism centers, I'm forgetting the exact term, fusion centers to like get access to the ISPs. It's not that deeper level, and it's coming out. They didn't do that good a job at keeping it under wraps if we take these stories as true. Therefore, it's not actually, it's a sign of weakness in my opinion. But what does this mean? This is the response of all these governments trying to use 20th century spy operation tactics in the 21st century where you have fundamentally different tools and capabilities. And for anybody, you were talking about end-to-end encryption with Signal, we're always going to find a way. Even when I was like a little bit very cynical about the state of journalism, this is an existential threat to journalism. In the conversation with Shaban Sachs and I was saying that kind of thing. Journalists will always find a way, I think.
They try to find a way around it.
P2P encryption, whatever.
I think the thing with this, they didn't realize how extensive. It's like if a journalist doesn't realize how extensive the tools are against them, they're always going to have trouble keeping their sources private. And I think that's what came out in this. It's like they had access to everything that was on their phone, meaning every number that was on that cell phone basically was legit or was viable or was basically exposed.
Which means you can branch out. You can like, in fact, you can discover the network.
Source.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, and I get your point about weakness, but is it effective? And the answer was, of course, yes.
I don't know that it was, though.
They were able to get information on various journalists almost immediately on some of the cases. Not all cases, because they weren't able to hack every last situation.
It seems like in most of the actual analysis, they have 50,000 names, but they only analyzed something like 70 phones, I think it was. And then half the phones were inapplicable, and of the half the phones, the 30-something
like
phones.
Android didn't keep tags.
Yeah, exactly. Android didn't keep tracks of the ones that they were closely tracking. A lot of the phones hadn't even been infected. They'd just been targeted. They received this zero-click text message thing that would have corrupted their phone.
It's not a perfect
if they clicked
process.
It. That's my point, is it's not a perfect process. And even then, from everything that's come out, it seems like there was very clearly suppression. Maybe some people got killed. I don't know how deeply effective it was, though, because I don't know what the alternative is. There could have been a lot of successful journalism that was done under these regimes, you know what? And in the case of Azerbaijan, you brought this up. There was this scandalous information that was released. There's this journalist in Azerbaijan almost a decade ago. She was targeted, it seems, by the government, who, like, the word is, installed cameras inside her house. They got footage of her having sex with her boyfriend. Then they blackmailed her, saying they would release it if she didn't change her behavior, stop doing her research. Then they did release it, but they released it through, like, a website that was spoofed to look like the opposition political party's website. Had nothing to do with NSO Group. That's a bit of a tacky thing to do if you actually look at it. I could talk about it, but it's a little bit of a weird thing to do. That's, I would argue, is a sign of weakness. And my point is, she is still operating. She's come under a lot of pressure. It made her life hellish for a while, but she allowed them to go through it. That this sex tape got released, and she's still trucking, and she was one of the people who was targeted by the NSA group. These government, that's my point, is I think it is a sign of weakness.
Well, her rationale was there needs to be a symbol of somebody who keeps going. That was her point.
Yeah,
And she was like, it makes you scared to use the toilet because you don't even know.
And at the end of the day, who cares about that kind of thing? Like,
Yeah.
I don't. That's a serious thing for them to do.
Yeah.
And I hope I would have her boldness to be willing to do what I was doing, despite that being released, because it's certainly unpleasant and undignifying. But it didn't stop her.
It didn't stop her. I mean, but like I said, some of these people got killed, and it puts a chilling effect on journalism, especially in like Brazil and Mexico, where you're figuring, yeah, let's take calls. 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. There's one thing I want to go to real quick too. Joe Biden. Joe Biden gave a speech yesterday. And in that speech, where he was kind of trumpeting the infrastructure plan, because again, Chuck Schumer is going to put this out tomorrow, he starts going into this thing once again about capitalism, autarky, and he says the following. Let's play this clip, Andre.
And now the forecasters have doubled their projections for growth this year in the economy to 7% or higher. In fact, the U.S. is the only developed country in the world where growth projections today are stronger than they were before the pandemic hit. At the same time, companies across the country are giving workers a raise, unusual thing. And the number of new unemployment claims has been cut by more than half since I took office. And by the way, 2 weeks ago, I issued a major executive order promoting fair and open competition, which is the cornerstone of American capitalism. Banning non-compete clauses that suppress workers' wages, lowering the price of things like hearing aids, prescription drugs, internet service, along with dozens of other actions. Folks, it turns out capitalism is alive and very well. We're making serious progress to ensure that it works the way it's supposed to work, for the good of the American people.
Let's stop right there. That's such a weird statement. Like, you're making an argument about an infrastructure plan that is very straightforward to the American population, that you're basically saying, I'm trying to do XYZ of the American populace. But for Biden, it continues to be cut in this larger lens, as if he's like not just a president of the United States, but he's, you know, the arbiter of capitalism. He's the steward of this, the avatar of this, the show that this can work against autarky and China. It's like he is in this weird spot where he has to even A, say it, which is strange, but B, if you have to say it, I think that's weakness in and of itself.
That's a sign of weakness,
that's
too.
a sign of
Everywhere.
weakness. Like
It's
nobody's
a sign of weakness
business.
everywhere. I'm just kidding. But
I mean,
it's true.
like, when have you ever known a president having to make the argument for capitalism?
Yes.
Very strange.
Well, no, that has happened.
When?
We've defended it.
I mean, if FDR says I saved capitalism.
Yeah.
How far back was that?
Well, but wasn't that like the whole Cold War period? This is slightly before my time, but weren't we like constantly championing capitalism? Maybe not in this slightly receded, recessive position.
I mean, but supposedly we were supposed to have won. Like the other there are no, the communist governments have fallen, right?
No, they haven't.
Well, you have China, who's,
China and Cuba.
Characteristics.
China, which is reigning transcendent, and Cuba, which is a ripe prize
and China
for
has
the plucking
basically
right now.
put a leash around capitalism and tried to ride it. But you get my point. It's not like we're not in the Cold War stuff. It was believed that we had basically won, and now we're going to this notion of he has to defend capitalism. It just sounds very strange.
Yeah, I agree.
Let's go to callers.
I think it is a sign of weakness, and it's a little bit weird, but you're right. Let's go to callers.
Let's go to callers. We have Michael in Sydney. I'm sorry. Michael in Sydney. What's going on, Michael?
Yeah. Hey, guys. Look, Jamarl and Shane, I don't know. I say, Jamarl, you were saying about taking risks. That's what you want to do. You have the right to take risks. Getting on the space shuttle at age 82 or whatever that it is. And by the way, anyone knows how phallic Jeff Bezos' rocket looks? Even more phallic than normal rocket.
I'm pretty sure that's just how rockets kind of,
Yeah, rocket's definitely been to CM oil. But anyway. But
it's like aerodynamic, right? Anyway, Michael, go for it.
Well, at the end of the day, you accuse people who don't want to get vaccinated as being petri dishes. Well, I've actually had registered nurses tell me it's currently the vaccinated who are walking around infecting more people than the people who aren't vaccinated because they don't know they're sick because they're asymptomatic, and they're actually breeding these new superbugs.
But they have a lower viral load. Okay, whatever.
They're going to be resistant. They're going to breed superbugs. They're going to breed this new supervirus.
Or you get that in the unvaccinated, or you get a much higher rate of overall infection between individual people, which means that it can more freely circulate between individual people, which means that it can more freely mutate because it's able to transmit. I've heard some arguments, it's just a little bit above my pay grade when it comes to the specific structure of the mRNA vaccines. I've heard some arguments there is my point. But the broader argument and the way that you're putting it doesn't fly with me at all. You're talking about the petri dish of the vaccinated. We'll talk about the petri dish of the unvaccinated, all the people who are freely carrying and conveying COVID to the next one without any natural immunity.
Is the right to respond?
Go for it. I'm responding to them, Michael, but go for it.
Well, okay, I'll respond, right? You guys have gone out, you've raced out, taken a totally brand new type of vaccination. We've never had these vaccinations in the whole existence of humanity.
Wait, say that again.
AstraZeneca, at least AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, we know what the side effects are. We know the knowns. You guys have no idea. You're messing with your own genetic structure. You've vaccinated your whole entire breeding population with an experimental type of medication that's interfering with your RNA and DNA.
Michael, 5,000 people were dropping dead a day. Do you get the gravity of that? I don't think you get the gravity of that. 600,000 people have lost their lives in this country.
Yeah, maybe 3.5 million in India.
Yeah. I mean, the numbers are extraordinary. And you're saying this like, it's like we know what the knowns are and we don't know what the unknowns are. Look, I give you that there is, more research that is being done on mRNA and everything else, but that wasn't done in this kind of piecemeal scenario where everything was great and people were running through the daisies. It was done under this notion that people were dropping dead like flies and they were trying to find something to do in order to stem the tide. And so I feel you, but the preponderance of scientific evidence is on my side on this, and I'm okay with that. If something happens later on down the line, okay, fair enough. I don't know that. By the same token, I do know what I know now. And what I know now is a lot of people were dropping dead, and there was needed to be a way of stemming the tide. And from the standpoint of people getting sick, the overwhelming majority of the people who are getting infected are unvaccinated. If you're looking at the probabilities of chances of getting a variant or whatever, it's going to be with those people considering they're the overwhelming majority of the people who are getting the virus. But, Michael, we've had this fight before. I'm going to move to Tarif. You can always go back, and we can always have this fight.
Actually, I don't know that. Oh, Tarif is on.
Yeah. So, Tarif, New Orleans, what's going on, Tarif?
Thanks for taking my call. I got about 4 quick comments. It's going to be quick. Okay, free Julian Assange, free Derlinger. Amnesty International got to see Julian Assange as a prisoner of conscience. Stella Morris tweeted out something yesterday that one of the Tories, conservatives, people in the British government, is trying to push a secrecy act that's similar to the Espionage Act, will make it harder for whistleblowers, journalists, and activists in Britain to leak classified or publish classified material. 31, Whitney Webb published an article on this cyber thing called cyber reasoning that's in the U.S. government with the U.S. contractors and the military government is using. They have a background similar to Pegasus. And Russia unveiled over the weekend and also today the new technologies. They unveiled 2 new technologies. The MiG-41 that's supposed to compete against the F-35 and it's cheaper, somewhat stealthy, but not as stealthy as the F-35, and also the Primus. Dang, I can't say the word. This new missile system that looks to be the S-500. I just saw it on RT. The missile system is huge and it's super fast. I need to go check that out. Russia just released that. That's supposed to designed to shoot down low orbiting satellites, stealth aircraft, and also hypersonic missiles. It's designed to knock out hypersonic missiles. That's all I want to say today.
Tarif, thanks for the call. And Tarif, you were the one who gave us the heads up on the Pegasus story yesterday, so thank you for that. I'm going to close this out. Brave, we didn't get to you. I didn't see Tarif, so I thought we would be able to get to you. I'm sorry, man, we didn't get to you. Please call back at 9:45. You know we often bring you on, and you've only got like 20 or 30 seconds to talk. If you call in, I'll try to like move you up in the line even if you come in later, just so you have enough time. But we got to close this one out, Brave. I'm sorry. We'll be coming back on the other side of this short break, talking with Danny Shaw about the latest going on in Haiti, Cuba. We may even talk about Pedro Castillo's win in Peru. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We've been paying attention to the story that has been taking place right now in Haiti. The president, Jovenel Moise, was assassinated. Several of the people came out of Colombia, many of which were trained by the United States. Again, a very strange situation. And right now, it is an unclear situation in regards to what is going to take place. The interim prime minister, Joseph, has basically stepped down this week. And what is going to happen in the upcoming elections? Are there going to be protests? There's talk about whether or not the U.S. or the UN should be or get more involved. In order to have a conversation about it, we're joined with Professor Danny Shaw. He's International Affairs Analyst and Professor of Latin Studies at City University of New York. Danny, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the show. Danny, can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh, there you are. Yes, now we can hear you. Absolutely.
Yeah, good morning. Good morning, Jamal. Good morning, Shane.
Good morning. So I came across this note or came across the article about the interim prime minister stepping down. It just seems like it's chaos. Can you give us an understanding of what is taking place right now in Haiti and what is going to take place as a result of the prime minister stepping down? For that matter, why did he step down?
Yeah, well, suddenly this weekend, the core group led by the United States pivoted really from one ruling class candidate, one prime minister who means nothing to the Haitian people, to another. These are 7 prime ministers in 4 years during the tenure of Jovenel Moise before he was murdered. So Ned Price and the State Department put out these statements really giving no indication why they pivoted from Claude Joseph to Ariel Henry. But these are, again, 2 candidates, completely unelected prime ministers who have no popular backing. This is at the summits of ruling class power up in Pétionville in the richest of neighborhoods. So this will have no impact on what the everyday Haitian people are going through with a currency that's extremely devalued, that's at 104 goods right now for $1, gasoline, food, extremely scarce right now throughout Haiti. So the popular organizations continue to organize down below across Port-au-Prince, and they're organizing for the right to organize because the state of siege is still in effect for another few days, until 15 days since the official moment when the former president / puppet was assassinated.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned it in those terms, the president / puppet. Everyone who I've talked to on the issue of Haiti, and I've had friends who've lived in Haiti for, months on end, they talk about basically U.S. influence in Haitian politics and how it basically undermines any legitimacy of whatever particular candidate or whatever particular person that is running the government. Like you said, in this case, you basically had an interim prime minister. The U.S. basically loses favor in the guy, and the guy steps down, bringing on Henry, I think the name is pronounced. Is this basically how the Haitian people view their political system? That is basically illegitimate and under the auspices of U.S. control because of such. I mean, it's because it's illegitimate because it's under the auspices of U.S. control. Is that basically the perspective of Haitians?
That's 100% correct. A lot of the protests, where do they go? They go directly in front of the U.S. Embassy because they understand where power flows from in Haiti. And there's been so much confusion in the Haitian American community. A lot of people were jolted by the assassination of Moise, but ignored how many weeks and months of massacres and displacement of thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of Haitians from the popular movement but now a lot of Haitian Americans are mobilizing. And there's been a lot on social media that this was some great martyr. You know, they're holding him up like this was Dr. Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or something. And it's like, where's the historical context? You know, and no one's saying that his death should be celebrated, but there should be clarity about who Jovenel Moise represents, along with these other sycophants who are now in line to take power. So nothing has shifted in the lives of everyday Haitians. They're looking to take the streets again. Different popular movements are going deeper and deeper into their peasant base, into their lumpen proletariat base. The lumpen proletariat is massive in Haiti, some 3 million people, mostly in Port-au-Prince. These are young people, young men, jobless, many of them now armed, trying to fend for themselves in this dog-eat-dog, capitalist, imperialist, white supremacist world. So that's going to be one of the key actors too. Again, completely independent and far, far away from really these meaningless moves at the top, and whatever Ned Price in the State Department says, the Haitian people are continuing to fight against grinding poverty, hunger, the devaluation of their currency. So these are the real issues, the issues that CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News won't touch.
Right. They miss that. What they see is palace intrigue. Oh, the president was assassinated. They're not necessarily saying, because for the most part, they didn't cover the protests here. Like the protests that you're talking about in Haiti that basically had gone on for weeks on end, they never really covered that. That was one of those things, meaning they're lavishing all of this attention on the Cuban protests, but they pick and choose in regards to the protests that they want. Haiti wasn't one of those. And so who was Jovenel Moise? Meaning, for the most part, you're saying people are making a martyr of him. But as you kind of made mention, there were protests against that government for weeks on end. And I remember covering those protests. We had people who used to work here, Eugene Perrier, who was there at the protests, covering those protests as they were taking place. Why were there protests against the government? And I think you pointed out this other thing about poverty, joblessness, etc. Isn't that the real issue more than anything else? It's like, yes, there's a palace intrigue, but underlying all of the issues associated with Haiti, yes, there's U.S. control, but at the end of the day, it's not having various opportunities and not having those opportunities create, let's say, a tinderbox in regards to the country itself.
Exactly. That's the tinderbox, and how important that internationalists, reporters, whether they were from here or Brazil or Argentina, there's been a few of us who've been able to be in Haiti and document this sustained, protracted, anti-imperialist, anti-neoliberal movement, a similar movement that's gone on in Chile and in Colombia. But as you said, of course, the crocodile tears from the U.S., they want to just sing freedom over and over, supposedly, for Cuba. And that's the front page newspaper story every day. So they're extremely selective. They segregate their tiers where it's convenient for them. And we have to bring in the role of the Colombians, of the Duque regime, of the U.S.'s #1 U.S. military base across the entire hemisphere. Colombia, a country where they have thousands of troops mobilized and deployed, U.S. troops, 9 U.S. military bases. And the Colombians, it was 26 paid Colombian mercenaries that took out Jovenel Moise. And every day there's this new headline that throws us off the scent of these Colombians, that it was this or that bourgeois Haitian politician who ordered the assassination, as if one isolated individual in Haiti had all this power independent of U.S. intelligence services, of the U.S. embassy. Nothing happens in Haiti. None of this palace intrigue happens without them.
Why do you, I mean, I've heard people make the point of saying, well, the U.S. has something to do with whacking, in base terms, Moise. And the catch becomes, well, why? If Moise was already a puppet of the U.S. government, and pretty much anybody that was coming up in the Haitian political system was a puppet of the U.S. government, then why would they need to, kill him or assassinate him using the mercenaries? I guess, fill in the gaps for me on that, because I've heard people make that argument, saying an election is coming up and either candidate is going to be a puppet of the U.S., et cetera, et cetera. But if Moise was already that person, why would it need to take place?
And that polemic continues to play out. As Walter Rodney said, neocolonialism is a one-armed bandit. So neocolonialism, the same system that gives, quote unquote, can take. So as quickly as they propped up Moise in this neocolonial artificial way, very few popular votes in 2016, 500,000 quote unquote popular votes in a country of 12 million, they could just as easily pivot and say, hey, this Moise is getting in our way. I mean, the U.S. and the core group, they have their project, whether Moise is alive, dead, they could really care less because the imperial project is the same. To keep Haiti from making any alliance with Peru, which has chosen this massive prize of the South American chessboard. Peru has chosen a new way forward. We know about Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua. Nicaragua celebrated an important anniversary, 42 years of revolution yesterday, the Sandinistas. And what the U.S. is going to do, no matter how exploited, no matter how plundered, no matter how understood Haiti is, they're going to do everything to ensure that this is still a pliant neo-colony that can give them that vote, that can, in the OAS, that can give them that relationship with Taiwan, that relationship with Colombia. So
Taiwan.
No question that they were.
Wait, I want to pause there for a second. Where does Taiwan come in?
Yeah, that's a weird.
Where does
that's
Taiwan
a weird
come in?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Jovenel Moise was one of the few dictators in the world who recognized Taiwan, but wouldn't recognize the People's Republic of China. The Colombian mercenaries, where did they run? Where did they hide? They went right to the Taiwanese embassy. Why? They thought that was the only place that they could survive the wrath of the Haitian people, because the Haitian people may never have liked Jovenel Moise, but they also don't like foreigners and other puppets and mercenaries coming into their country and taking out their, quote unquote president. So there was a feeling of patriotism and national dignity. But that's where Taiwan comes in. So it's all about keeping Haiti in the sphere of U.S. imperialism.
So they can be another vote, basically, like in the Organization of American States, effectively. They can just, it can be, if you're looking at a chart of who was present, who was absent, who voted in for or against any given motion. I'm speaking slightly abstractly. Basically, they're on our side in a lot of these issues, and so it's in our interest to keep them pliant. Even though economically, that country is devastated. Yeah. The deforestation. One thing before we close, we're going to be coming back with Cuba, and so before we pivot, I wanted to ask one last question. You mentioned random individuals who hired mercenaries and who you say are being sort of put up as distractions from the fundamental thing, which is all of these Colombians and the potential U.S. connection, potential U.S. hiring being behind this. What about this doctor? What the heck is the connection with the doctor that he is going to be, he's putting himself forward as the new president? Who is this person? Professor Shaw.
Yeah, Shane, those are salacious headlines because they got this doctor there. He was all over the front pages last week. Christian Emmanuel no. And really, I think he's just another fall guy. Supposedly, the DEA and U.S. intelligence services went and met up with him and said, well, we can guarantee you can be at the helm of the new democracy of Haiti. So they lured him in. This morning, again, there's other similar headlines. The Colombian media is saying similar things, as though one fall guy somehow has the power to take out presidents, ignoring the role of, this is a smoking gun, 26 paid Colombian mercenaries trained through a right-wing security firm in Miami owned by a right-wing Venezuelan, an anti-Chavista. I mean, this has all the components of a soap opera, of a conspiracy theory, yet it's all too real. And this is what the U.S. media refuses to focus on.
It's bizarre. It is bizarre. We got to close here. But I mean, when we first started to talk about this doctor, Jamarl and I were going back and forth on it, and we brought up Juan Guaido, a U.S. attempted installed puppet leader of Venezuela, who at least had the cachet of having been part of the National Assembly, having been part of Congress. This seems like a true outsider. I wouldn't say inexplicable. It's just bizarre. And it did seem like a kind of, I don't know, either a distraction or just a weird sort of almost red herring kind of a thing last week. But we've got to close this segment so we can come back and talk about Cuba, also worthy of conversation. We're joined by Professor Danny Shaw. He's an international affairs analyst and professor of Latin American studies at CUNY, that's City University of New York. You can follow Danny on Twitter at Danny Shaw, CUNY. why. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back with Professor Shaw on the other side of this short break talking about Cuba. Be right back.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking about ongoing political events in the Caribbean. We were just talking about Haiti. We're moving on over to a neighboring island, that of Cuba. We're going to be speaking about the current political fracas there, which, again, you use the phrase crocodile tears. It's weird how we choose to dispense our emotions about things, because we've been paying a lot of attention to what's been going on in Cuba, not nearly as much attention to what's been going on in Haiti. And so let's get into the conversation about Cuba. We've talked about the unspoken. Let's try to speak the unspoken again on this very popular issue. Marco Rubio and Miami's mayor have both come out as probably the most prominent anti-Cuban government, Cuban political figures in the United States. Both, harshly calling for either intervention or for the extension of sanctions. Meanwhile, Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are among those calling for the sanctions to be dropped. This massive embargo that Donald Trump resumed after the brief break from it under Obama. I guess we can start there. We can talk about the propaganda, all this stuff. But do you see any potential signs of movement, enough pushback that a lifting of sanctions under Biden is possible? It would be a move contra Trump and in line with Trump's predecessor, his former president, Obama. In other words, I could see him potentially doing it. But what do you on the other hand, he might come across as weak. Biden was just championing capitalism yesterday in a speech that he gave. In other words, he's kind of drawn his line in that particular patch of sand. But do you have any hope of this? Professor Shaw, what do you see happening?
Well, I certainly don't have any hope or illusions about the Biden administration or any U.S. administration. I saw a great meme out there that in one lifetime, Fidel Castro had done more for humanity than all of the U.S. presidents over the past 250 plus years. And I don't think that's hyperbole. I think there's a lot of historical truth to that. What Biden is reviewing right now is the remittances. The propaganda war, the ideological war is so strong that Biden is saying, the nerve, the audacity, he's saying, we really can't change anything with the remittances because the Cuban government is basically stealing all of these remittances, which is ridiculous because of the blockade, the Helms-Burton bill, which illegally penalizes any third country that dares to interact economically or diplomatically with Cuba. The Cubans, of course, have been completely shut off from hard currency. So they've always toyed with remittances, played with Cubans' lives, because these remittances, these hard currency, $1 US worth 25 Cuban pesos. So this is a lifeline. There is this historical dependency. Let's not forget that before the 1959 revolution, Cuba was a neo-colony. The process of liberation is a long, protracted one. So to play with these remittances and cut Cuban families off is an act of war. It's illegal. We see the United Nations. I wouldn't say the United Nations is standing up, but they have these corny votes, which mean absolutely nothing because the United Nations is a plaything in the hands of U.S. imperialism. But every year in September, they vote. In 185 nations, 194 nations denounce the blockade, are against the blockade, yet there's the blockade stronger than ever. So the headlines from the New York Post and all the sound bites from Marco Rubio, they're playing with Cubans' lives, this nation of 11 million people, which continues to be subjected to this hybrid war.
What do you think, or what do you think this country gets wrong about the conflict between the United States and Cuba? Because Shane and I was talking about this yesterday, and I was making the point that I don't believe for a moment that Joe Biden believes Cuba is a threat. And in the context of that, you still have sanctions, and you still have these things that are these kind of Cold War vestiges where it's like, well, they were there for 50 years, so they have to remain almost. But the problem is, when Obama tried to bring down the hysteria, the world didn't fall apart. And yet, the sanctions were put back on almost for political reasons and ratcheted up in order to, again, like you say, make people's lives miserable almost for purely political and geopolitical reasons. What do you think people get wrong from this country when they're looking at what is taking place right now in Cuba? And you hear, hey, maybe Biden should get more invested in everything else. And the country is not shocked that that perspective would be espoused. Meaning I'm saying it's a shocking thing for us to say we should get involved in a sovereign nation because there are protests. What are we getting, or what is the American public mistaking in our perspective of Cuba?
In all the time that I've spent in Cuba since 1995, at the height of the special period after the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc was no longer there, the Cubans have always drawn the lines between the people of the U.S. and the governments of the U.S. So Biden's not getting anything wrong, because Biden is a faithful representative of the rich, of the billionaires, of capital, just like Reagan before him and Bush and across the aisle, Democrat, Dixiecrat, Republican. They are against socialism. They're against equality. They're against Pedro Castillo. They're against the 33 million people of Peru. They're against all of these speeches from Biden. You'd think it was 1991.
No, you would.
Necessity of saying,
well, he's fighting for capitalism. Yeah, it's a very, it's very bizarre. Like I've never heard a president have to come out and basically defend capitalism, like directly, overtly, in these kind of weird terms. Under normal circumstances, it was just kind of assumed that that's how things were. Like, there was never there's a secondary competitor. It was just, I get the Cold War, but I'm talking about after the Cold War. It was just kind of, all right, we won, quote unquote. And so capitalism was just, it is what it is going forward. There wasn't a need to basically kind of enunciate this notion of the capitalism thing. I guess what I'm trying to get at, though, more specifically, so fair enough, I agree with you with the Biden thing. This was the case going all the way back, Monroe Doctrine and them attacking the various governments for United Fruit, for example. But when you're getting into this notion of, let's say, like the Cubans in Florida, and somewhat of a right-wing perspective in regards to the way they look at Cuba, I mean, in their heads, they're okay with U.S. intervention. Like, what's their perspective on this stuff, and why do they have this particular perspective in regards to the United States and how we should be more invested in that country? Does it make sense? I hope the question makes sense. I'm trying to get into their heads.
100%.
Okay.
It's called American dreaming. I mean, Ernesto Che Guevara, 5 decades ago, talked about how difficult it is to organize a people who have dollar signs, American flags, and whiskey in their eyes. And that pretty much describes a lot of these Cuban Americans who are much more American dreamers than Cuban dreamers, certainly. So this is part of the battle of ideas. They've bought into all the illusions of quote-unquote American exceptionalism and American democracy. In the Cuban leadership and the everyday Cuban people have had to remain so steadfast. We remember the Bay of Pigs. We remember all of the assassination attempts against Cuban leadership, Fidel Castro, of course, the bombing of innocent Cuban airlines, the bombing of hotels, all types of terrorism, economic terrorism of the blockade. But the audience should research out there all of the criminal bombings in Havana to discourage tourists. They were willing to do anything to try to reinvade Cuba. So this is all part of a war on socialism. The main ideologues right now, the Marco Rubios, then you have Biden. Everyone's attacking Black Lives Matter, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, so they continue to try to dominate their narratives. No one has the right in the U.S. media to stand up and defend Cuba for 1 second. On mainstream television, you cannot utter one word in defense of Cuban self-determination, of Cuban socialism. So we understand that socialism is a system of abundance, of equality, but what the blockade does is the blockade is all about scarcity. So then the capitalists can point and say, look, Cuba, a failed state, pure scarcity, hungry people, fleeing people, and CNN is always there every time a Cuban has to flee. But if you're on a small island in the Caribbean of 11 million people, of course people are going to migrate when they're up against the Goliath the global Goliath. So capitalism is inequality, and that's what's behind all of this rhetoric, all these quote unquote freedom songs in Miami, and Gloria Estefan and CNN with the fake tears and all these blimps on the Miami beaches about invading Cuba. It's all about recolonization of a country who dared to free themselves from
Danny,
the neo-colonial shackles.
We're going to have to stop there. I mean, I really do appreciate you coming on, especially for the short notice. Professor Danny Shaw is an international affairs analyst and professor of Latin American studies at City University of New York. You can follow Danny on Twitter at Danny Shaw Cooney. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another hour, our last hour this morning, in fact, of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states and the surface of our increasingly divided globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable you're indefatigable, you're ever vigilant, last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We keep asking Jamarl to come down from that wall, but he will not.
He will not. Last man.
It's true. It's true. He's committed. Anyway, let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, there are about 55,828 new COVID cases reported in the United States yesterday. That is a huge count compared to the count yesterday or in recent weeks. It's almost doubling of numbers we've seen recently. In the last couple of days, and it's a tripling of the caseload we saw a couple of weeks ago. This comes as there are about 622 new deaths. Over the past week, there have been an average of 35,035 cases per day. That's an increase of 198%. That's the tripling from the average 2 weeks earlier. 49% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 56% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected about 34,097,758 people across the United States and killed 608,811 of us. I want to come back to the vaccine and variant thing for at least a minute or two. I know we talk about it a lot, but there's a thought that came to mind. New COVID cases and hospitalizations in the United States are predominantly among the unvaccinated, with 95% of cases and 93% of hospitalizations among those who haven't yet received a vaccine. In Louisiana, 97% of the state's cases and deaths since February have been from the unvaccinated. Not too much of a surprise, but worth saying for the people in the back. A report released today estimates that India's deaths during the coronavirus pandemic are 10 times the official total, with the total excess deaths standing somewhere between 3 million and 4.7 million. Although these would not all likely be from the coronavirus, it's a strong indication that there are more deaths from COVID than have been officially confirmed, potentially 10 times more, an order of magnitude more, which would single-handedly double the total death load of COVID, I think. If I'm doing the math right, we passed 4 million total deaths recently. If suddenly we went from approximately 300 and something thousand deaths in India to 4 million, that's basically a doubling, at least, statistically in retrospect, not saying it's new. In national news, Donald Trump predicted that TV news ratings would slump following his departure from the Oval Office. So far, he isn't wrong. Since a sharp jump in January following the election and January 6th, ratings for both primetime news and newspapers, including the New York Times, have consistently slumped compared to where they were last year. CNN is most deeply affected among TV news outlets. Its primetime audience has dropped 45% in the last few weeks. Sing hallelujah, it has come. Salvation, CNN, going down the gutter, just like the prophets told us foresaw. No, I'm just happy. Who likes CNN? Are there anybody like, the liberals, quote unquote, like MSNBC, the Republicans, quote unquote, or the conservatives, they like Fox.
Yeah.
Who likes CNN? The messy middle?
I think the MSNBC crowd at this point.
Yeah.
I mean, especially since they seem to have lined up against Trump. I mean, It seems like that. I don't know. It just seems like they've lined up against Trump so heavily that MSNBC, CNN are these kind of tandem networks in a weird way.
It's true. Trump was in the pillory on all these outlets for so long, and everybody liked to come along and throw verbal tomatoes at his face. And then as soon as they saw he was too dangerous, even in the pillory, even making fun of him and talking smack about him constantly, and there's good reason to, he's too dangerous, we got to kick him off, and apparently stop talking about him because he is in the past after all now. And that hasn't done good for them. People liked throwing tomatoes at Trump. Watching MSNBC.
It's like, okay, what's going to scare me today?
Exactly. Exactly. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has announced plans to float the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill in the Senate with a vote set for tomorrow. A rioter from the January 6th Capitol breach has been given an 8-month prison sentence for the first for his felony. This is the first sentencing of any of the people who breached the Capitol. Again, 8 months. It's not years, but this is the first of what we will expect to be many to come. A lot more of these sentences. Doled out to be soon, I'm sure. In international news, Peru is set to declare Pedro Castillo as the new president over Keiko Fujimori. The official announcement will be sometime next week, but the National Jury of Elections has been announced that Castillo beat Fujimori by 44,058 votes. That came out yesterday evening. Haiti's acting Prime Minister Claude Joseph stepped down. He is being replaced by Ariel Henry. These changes follow the assassination of former Haitian President Jovenel Moise 13 days ago, which we spoke about earlier on with Danny Shaw in the last half hour of the show. Also talked about Cuba. Good segment. Go check it out. Although you and I were talking over the break. I might want to come back to this too. The last couple of minutes of what Danny was saying, we were so close to it that I didn't have enough time to get into an argument.
Right.
But I kind of wanted to push back a little bit. So we'll come back to it. Maybe you can come back on it some point.
Both of us were like, I don't know if I agree entirely with what he's saying here, but it's like 30 seconds. I just heard him 30 seconds.
Exactly. Exactly. In tech news, also in international news, I suppose, and this is big news. We talked about this earlier. A major report released this weekend by Forbidden Stories, the OCCRP, Citizen Lab, and over a dozen other organizations highlights the company NSO Group and its Pegasus malware service, through which dozens of government and government-affiliated agents and agencies have targeted domestic dissidents, including journalists, for spying by using zero-day exploits to access their phones' most basic functions. So basically, you send a text to somebody through one of these services. They don't even need to click inside the link click inside the text onto a link. Nevertheless, just by opening it, their phones get hacked effectively. It's a zero-click exploit. Then they're inside your phone. They have root-level access to your camera, to your text messages, to pretty much the apps that you would use as a journalist to go about your business. And this, of course, sparks many concerns internationally. Implicated in the use of Pegasus include many governments, including India, Azerbaijan, and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud, who reportedly used it against Jeff Bezos a couple of years ago. I don't think we actually talked about this in the conversation. There's a lot to cover with this Pegasus story, but you remember Jeff Bezos?
It's a penis pic, right?
I don't know. There might have been.
I thought it was some weird.
It was the affair thing.
Yeah.
You remember? Okay, so Jeff Bezos, richest person in the world again, but for a little while, Elon Musk took the seat. Now, why was that possible? Because Jeff Bezos got divorced from Mackenzie Bezos, who took a big chunk of his net worth.
Right.
So she took that. Elon Musk wouldn't have stood a chance if that hadn't happened. Now, why did Mackenzie Bezos leave Jeff Bezos? Maybe deeper problems latent in the relationship, or there was this big thing that I think it was the National Enquirer tabloids broke, where basically Jeff Bezos was pictured with his mistress having an affair, and this sort of, led to immediately, even though it probably wasn't the full cause of, the divorce between Mackenzie and Jeff. MBS did that. Mohammed bin Salman did that using the Pegasus service, hacking into Jeff Bezos' phone. This was reported at the time, and now that same service, Pegasus, is reasserting itself in this story.
Penis pic.
There you go.
It was a penis pic. Right here, the Jeff Bezos sexting saga just took another wild turn. On Wednesday, the United Nations called for an immediate investigation of the alleged hacking of Bezos' iPhone, citing forensic evidence showing WhatsApp account linked to the Saudi prince himself. Wow.
That is wow. I'm glad that you have curved glasses, Jamarl, because if they weren't curved, I might be able to see the pic from their reflection, but as it is, I'm like immune.
I'm not looking at the pickaxe.
Good to hear. NSFW, man, we're on the air. I'm just a little bit scandalized here, Jamarl.
looking at the pickaxe.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. We got a couple more headlines to get through. The NFT market, this is non-fungible token market, OpenSea, hit a massive $1.5 billion valuation. The company stated that the biggest growth problem they have right now is due to infrastructure issues with the Ethereum blockchain, throwing some shade at Ether, I suppose. Vitalik Buterin, I think, is the name of the creator of that. We can come back to that. There's a lot to talk about after headlines here. In Earth and Science news, happening right now, as I hear, Jeff Bezos is launching into space on New Shepard. The flight is currently delayed by about 10 minutes. Will launch in T3 and counting. Thank you, Austin. This comes weeks after Richard Branson beat the former Amazon CEO to the U.S. legal definition of space. That's 86 kilometers. Bezos' Blue Origin flight is expected to get about 106 kilometers high. That would pass the Kármán line, more universally believed to be the start of space, which is set at 100 kilometers high. Bezos' flight also marks the first entirely civilian space crew with 100% autopilot flight sequences. Back home, 185,000 people have signed petitions to stop Bezos from returning to Earth. And I hear those petitions will work. He's not coming back.
He's just going to keep going.
Well, the thing is, he just handed the reins of Amazon over to this Andy Jassy guy.
Yeah.
He's free and clear.
He can go wherever he wants at this point.
Blue Origin's his thing, exactly. He could be on a one-way trip to Mars right now.
Well, I was looking at the thing. It said, Bezos, I could have done this flight as CEO of Amazon. Yeah.
I thought you were going to say, like, I could have done this years ago.
No.
Okay,
Bezos. I was just looking at the CNN thing about an up-to-date thing about what's going on.
But you said he couldn't have, right?
No, he said I could have.
I could have.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I could have done this flight as CEO of Amazon.
Interesting.
Quote, unquote.
Anyway, those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So I was looking over vaccine statistics variant statistics the other day. The speculation about exactly how transmissible the Delta variant is, it's speculative. There's a conversation going on about it. I saw some estimates as high as what was scary to me, like an R of 6, which is for every person who gets it, they pass it on to 6 other people. That's crazy high transmissibility, way higher than the base, the wild type variant of COVID. If that's true, I'm going to ask a rhetorical question that I will then answer. What are the implications for vaccines?
Yeah.
I saw people talking about this. Say you have a very effective vaccine that's nevertheless a bit less effective against this because the transmissibility is so damn high. It just produces more viral load. It repopulates, and so you spread it more easily to more people, which is the assumption here. Instead of having like a 65 or a 70 or a 75 or even 85% threshold for a vaccinated population to reach herd immunity, you need a much higher, like 98% was the estimate that I saw, which we're not going to reach, to be clear, unless you have it like mandated, which I don't see passing in the vast majority of countries.
Even if it got mandated, I don't see it.
Even then, you're probably right.
Yeah. I mean,
so what do we do?
You're talking about protests. You're talking about all sorts of stuff.
Yeah. So here's where I go. What do we do, Jamarl? Aren't we just kind of back at square one at this point? We know quite a bit about the coronavirus, but there are these new variants that are circulating that we can't really resist. The level of vaccine protection that we're not going to reach, to be clear, which means it's just going to spread. So what do we get? We get more lockdowns? Where does this go? Open conversation. Where does it go?
That's a really good question. I think it's a few things. Like you said, we know more about it. So there's more science on it. It's not like we started from zero where it's like, okay, how transmissible is it? Can you, if you're in buildings, does masks work? Like, we're not there. Even their ability to treat it has changed. So you have a higher propensity of people to live through it, even if they get infected by it. The vaccines do seem to work, even if it doesn't necessarily seem entirely to stop at 100%. Nobody had that expectation. But even with a higher transmissibility with the variant, it doesn't seem to kill the person with the vaccine. It just makes the person extremely, it just makes them ill much less ill than what a person if they didn't have it.
Yeah.
So I don't think we're in square zero, if that makes sense. It's just a complicated world. There's no way out per se.
That's true.
Yeah. It's not great.
It's taken off. That is the correct signal.
It's up.
You can, if you turn around, you wouldn't be able to talk directly into your mic, but you can see on that laptop right over there, you can see it taking off.
Bezos is going into space.
20 plus seconds, 22 seconds now. It is roaring up. I see it not crashing, which is a good sign for everybody aboard and for all of us too.
And it's mostly automated. I'm fascinated by that. I mean, look, this is a new era on some level. I mean,
and Musk is in third place.
Musk, I know, right? But Musk is going to do something different so he can, say I went higher and further or whatever else he's going to say.
I'm still into
or I went to the moon.
I'm pretty damn sure that the Musk that we know is a body double, and he is in that red Corvette in that spacesuit on the way to the depths of space. No, I kid. But.
Look, it is impressive on some level. You can understand why a government would want companies like this the technological, companies and everything else. I would imagine NASA, if it's not going to be building its larger shuttle to go to the moon or whatever else, is probably going to use for minor items or for space shuttle. They're probably going to be using these services from these shuttles. So, it's interesting. I mean, the catch becomes, what is this going to become? I think is the question. I mean, it's not just, meaning, yes, it's a billionaire that's getting into a shuttle. Why?
Yes.
Does he want to be in that shuttle? Maybe, maybe not, but he's getting into that for publicity, for further things. Like we were talking about earlier, I do believe that this is just the beginning. This is just the showboating of it all, of saying, business is open, guys.
Oh, totally.
Business is open. What do you need? What do you need?
Totally.
And the projects and the things that they need and everything else that people are going to be willing to pay for, they're going to be trying to find ways to monetize issues of space. I think that's what it's going to be. Government's role in this is probably going to be that much more of exploration, kind of what it was in the frontiers. All right, we're going to go to the moon. We're going to make some kind of rule set for how things are going to operate, and from point A to point B. It's going to be that, where they're catching up with these companies as they start going into space. So, no, it's really interesting. I just don't know. I strongly believe that this is going to end up with mining. I strongly believe this is going to be transport. I think all of this stuff is going to end up taking place with what these guys are doing. And look, it's not just going to be them. China has been doing space exploration. I mean, for God's sake, they're talking about doing a base with Russia near or on the moon.
Yes.
So, meaning it's not just going to be our billionaires doing this. There's going to be all sorts, what seems to be commerce in space.
It's true.
Whatever, for whatever good or ill.
And I would say more good, but I get people have pushback, and specifically against the private ownership. Can we pivot?
Go for it.
Because also, as a heads up, we had a pretty interesting and extensive conversation about this. Admittedly, a bit sci-fi-y or speculative or whatever, but still, we're trying to remain within the realm.
I resent that comment, Shane, about that it was sci-fi speculative. I so disagree with that, because I think that's where we're. But whatever. Go, get your
I
point,
take those
point.
as terms of pride, man. Maybe even in terms of art or something like that. But anyway, this was in the 7 o'clock hour from like 7:10 to 7:25 or so.
Yeah.
15 or so minutes of conversation. Good conversation, but I'm pivoting here to the kind of coming back to another one we were having earlier. But this has to do with a conversation with Kim yesterday. Kim Iverson joined us 9:15 yesterday. Great conversation with her. You didn't like it. But there was like a there was a back and forth, and you said that she put you in this mindset of, am I in a bubble? Because what she was saying was, you guys, what we were saying broadly was, a lot of people are being influenced by Fox News. And a lot of people are politically engaged, whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats that are influencing them. They're politically engaged. What she was saying was, we're in a bubble. Most people don't really care or pay attention to this stuff. A lot of young folks across the country, specifically, just that Biden isn't doing a good enough job at messaging. It's not that young people watch Fox 24/7 or are being deeply influenced by it. It's that Biden isn't doing his messaging right. And this is where I'm coming back. That you have these family and friend networks that will influence your behavior. And I think it was over the break that I said this. Every single case that I've seen of friends of mine or family of mine that have changed their mind on the vaccines have all come not from like a government agency asking them to do something, but from interpersonal communication. Whether it's my aunt and uncle who their daughter's a nurse in a hospital, and at first they were pretty iffy about vaccines and the whole lockdown thing. And then they were hearing from her, this is really bad. She got sick. She didn't do well with it. They're older, clearly, their daughter. And they decided to get the vaccine, even though they were hesitant at first, just by talking with her. Same thing with my friend Chris. For a while there was hesitant. I was like, I want to wait and see. At a certain point, wanting to hang out with family and friends and just genuinely gently encouraging him to get it, he went out and got it. It's like the subtle peer pressure kind of thing, not suppressing information, not keeping people from talking about it on social media. And even this is where I would go with it. The government and the Biden's administration and its attempts to get people to take the vaccine by influencing influencers to influence people.
That would be a far better way of doing it.
Oh, well, but here's the thing.
As opposed to shutting down. Because
as opposed to shutting down,
but even shutting down or trying to get people banned.
Even that's kind of tacky in my opinion. I think
what do you mean, trying to influence influencers? Yeah,
because I don't even know that that's going to make do. I think that I'm less likely to be influenced by an influencer than I am by like my mom or my son or my sister. You get my point? Yeah. I think that's how you do that. Now, I'm not. This isn't like the Gestapo. People shouldn't be reporting at each other, and of course that's ridiculous. I'm just bringing it up to clarify. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, it would be good if instead of doing this, Biden directly educated people, his administration directly explained variants vaccines, how they're supposed to relate, why you should get them, how they protect people, how effective they are, that whole thing. That should be the cause without which nothing else happens. No suppression until you make your case extremely clear. Even then, don't do the suppression. And he's not doing that right now.
I think the suppression thing is problematic. I love Kim as a guest. So it wasn't that I hated it. No, I hate it was at the end of the conversation, I felt weird about the conversation. It felt like it was unclear.
You were off
Or I
kilter.
started to doubt myself. I was like, Thor loses, his righteousness to lift up his hammer. But no, I started to think in the terms of, okay, am I in a bubble? And is she right that the news media and everything else is not as significant of a source? No, I came down to the side that, no, I still think she's wrong on that part, but I think she's right in that how you get this across is not in the way that they are getting this across. And I do agree with you that, just looking at the polling is very clear. 1/5 of adults now report being vaccinated after saying in January they plan on waiting to get the vaccination. And they did that, family, friends, etc.
Yeah.
That was the way to do it.
Yeah.
So, no, I do think the messaging, yes, explain your case, explain mRNA. And I think they've been doing that. I don't think you've been watching like when the people have been coming on and everything else and explaining. It's kind of dry. But I do think targeting that at people of saying, look, tell your son, tell your friend, tell your whatever. I think that would be the way to do it if you're trying to influence. Shutting down, I don't know, because I think honestly, I think the media has more of an effect of emboldening or validating a point of view as opposed to changing a point of view.
Yes, exactly. If people don't want to get the vaccine and they watch Fox and Fox gives them a reason to not want to get the vaccine,
it just validates them.
It's the confirmation bias thing. Real quick note, and we might want to, we should consider going to a break. They passed the Kármán line, hit 351,000 feet, 107 kilometers, and they, last I heard about a minute ago, were descending at 2,500 miles per hour and going faster.
Oh, so wait, so he didn't hit the 108
They did. They passed
kilometers?
it. Well, it got to 107. I think you're right. They were aiming for
So
like
his goal was 108?
They were aiming for above 100 kilometers, above the Kármán line, the official boundary line of space, which they passed.
106, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. I was going to jump on him. I was like,
he
did his 108.
hit his goal.
He failed in his mission.
He passed it.
He passes the 100. Oh, congratulations to Bezos.
I just hope that, what's her name? Wally, the one I was mentioning earlier, the 82-year-old woman. I hope she's doing okay.
Yeah.
That's all.
I would imagine she's on the moon right now.
Oh, well.
No pun intended.
No pun intended.
No
exactly.
pun intended.
I'm not sure about that.
I would imagine she is feeling amazing right now. But let's go to break.
Can you imagine that? Yeah, seriously. Lifelong dream like that. Anyway, let's go to a break. You guys have been listening to our headline segment. We're going to be coming back with our next guest talking about South Africa. We're going to be speaking with Heribert Adam. First time on this show. Coming back with him in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
You check top.
We couldn't put it better ourselves. Tune in to Political Misfits on Mondays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Miss the Press, our weekly takedown of Sunday's toothless news talk shows.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys are in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy.
One tiny note before we get to our guest.
Go for it.
They successfully touched down. The rocket touched down. The capsule is floating down. Apparently, they're coming down right now, I believe. Austin, real quick. The rocket, which is the booster effectively, right, has touched down on the ground, and the capsule that contains the people is floating down. Exactly.
It's like a little UFO floating down. It looks so weird.
You can see it. And what you can't see in that frame, of course, is the parachute above it. But it apparently mission success. So there we go. Congratulations to them.
Congratulations to Bezos on that one. He lived, I'm hoping, the 82 woman.
And it just touched down. I can see it right now, just touched down. It is resting a small cloud of dust. Anyway, that is a historical moment right there.
What, touching down?
That with just right now. Yeah, that was the first fully automated space flight.
Oh, I see what you mean. I see what you mean.
All civilian, for tourism purposes. Anyway, we have a guest on, but big news.
Yeah, we can talk about it in the wrap. All right, but we were also having this conversation on South Africa, and I've been trying to get to South Africa for a very long time, so I am very excited about our guests. The jailing of President Jacob Zuma, a former South African president, who is implicated in allegations of bribery, corruption during his tenure. He was held in contempt of court and sentenced to 15 months in prison for his repeated refusal to participate in the trial proceedings. Now, this led to all sorts of protests. The catch is that the protests were hurting more so the people who are in his own tribe, basically Zulus and people who are basically poor. The government labeled this as an insurrection. Major highways were blocked, trucks burned, shops, even schools and medical offices were ransacked. There was $1 billion in damage. 212 people have died in the mayhem. And my question was, why is this taking place? What is the current tenor of South Africa? And does this have anything to do with 74% unemployment among the youth? Joining us to have a conversation, we're joined with Herbert Adams, or Herbert Adam. He's author of more than a dozen books regarding ethnic conflict, human rights, comparative racism, and much more. He's a professor emeritus of political sociology at Simon Fraser University. He's a recipient of the Conrad Adenauer Research Award and was elected fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Herbert, thank you for joining us, or I should say Professor Adam, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate it. I've been watching what has been taking place with South Africa with a certain amount of question. And I remember many of the issues that, with apartheid and everything else. And it's like, despite the fact that apartheid ended, you still had this massive skew of inequality that was basically left over from the previous instance, meaning changing the political system didn't necessarily change what that political system created over the course of the last X number of decades. And now you have this. You have basically Jacob Zuma going to prison and all hell breaking loose after it. Can you set the context for what is taking place right now in South Africa and why are 212 people dead and $1 billion in damage taking place? What happened and why?
This is a question everyone is asking. Clearly, when the looting broke out, these people who ransacked malls and destroyed shops and attacked gas stations and all this came as a total surprise. And the majority of those, everyone agrees, had nothing to do with Zuma. Zuma was a trigger which exploded a powder keg, which was a tinderbox simmering there for a long time, as you said already, of poverty, inequality, corruption, government incompetence, ideological obsessions.
But why would he be the trigger point for this? I mean, I know they say that people within his administration was kind of helping and pushing this along, but why would he be the emblem of this specific spiraling into chaos?
Those who instigated this, who mobilized it, were enemies of the Mandela tradition in the ANC. The ANC is, the ruling party is factionalized to an incredible extent. They are actually, the ANC are two parties. The President, Cyril Ramaphosa, wants to keep unity. That unity does de facto not exist. And it is likely that the ANC will split. So it was an insurrection by those Zuma loyalists, Zuma supporters, mainly Zulu people, who actually created or were very influential in creating the poverty and the corruption when Zuma was in power between 2009 and 2018. And he lost narrowly to Cyril Ramaphosa, who is weak, who basically leads a divided government and a divided party.
Well, that's what I was going to get into for the moment. You mentioned something that's pretty interesting, the ANC splitting or having basically two parties within the context of one party. The ANC was a party that basically took over at the end of the apartheid regime that had this, and correct me if I'm wrong, philosophical responsibility to navigate that country out of apartheid and somehow level that country out from the standpoint of economic concerns of the Africans that were there. And I guess the catch becomes, if you have this many people in poverty, it is not succeeding in its mission. And I guess that's two questions. What is the difference, or what is the break in the ideological difference between these two elements of the ANC? And why hasn't the ANC been able to accomplish its objectives in leveling out the issues of poverty and economics?
The ANC under Zuma was a party of self-enrichment by a black elite which neglected the poor and basically used tax resources for an incredibly high degree of corruption. That is, in short, the basis for the poverty which we have now. The economy was growing after Mandela was liberated, and his successor Thabo Mbeki was quite successful to create a black middle class, but that black middle class did more care about itself than about the poor in the townships, and the neglect by government of the township and shack dwellers led to a degree of frustration which actually expressed itself in almost daily, what they call in South Africa, social delivery protests, where they said nothing has changed for us, it is just the same as apartheid. And this is overlaid by the ideological discussion that we hear among Zuma supporters, that actually black business people or the black middle class are just collaborators of capitalism, agents of system. They want to basically create a socialist system, and if you are a socialist, you would support them. But the socialism for them is also a pretense to self-enrichment.
And arrogate more resources from the, like you said, tax appropriation. But I want to clarify something. You might not even have enough timeline. I mean, you might not have enough time to do a brief timeline of the apartheid, the post-apartheid era. But if we do, it'd be worth doing. Briefly, you said there are two main branches of the ANC. Which is the one that has been engaged in the plundering that you're talking about more? And what is the leadership? I think you said it was Zuma, right?
Zuma was in power between 2009 and 2018. And he is responsible basically for corruption, and his supporters lost in that insurrection which just took place.
Okay, so I'm sorry for interrupting, but I want to pause on this because this is what stuck out to me and confused me. I thought I misheard you. Why are his protesters then would be the ones who are engaging in the rioting here? Is it because they see that with him out of power, they won't have access to those resources anymore? They got used to having certain resources. Why are they, if he's the one who's been causing these problems, why are his supporters rioting when he gets put in prison? Shouldn't the population in general be happy about this? What am I missing?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of people who vandalized, the majority of those who looted were not interested in politics at all. It was opportunistic criminality.
Thank you.
You have when poor people are hungry, they basically don't. They're indifferent to high politics. But those who lost power in South Africa in 2018, when Zuma was replaced, wanted to recapture power and used this pretext of poverty to instigate and mobilize the ignorant, illiterate hungry people, those whom they neglected in the shacks and in the townships, to set the country alight.
The World Bank last year deemed South Africa the world's most unequal society, estimating that the top 10% owned 70% of the nation's assets in 2015. The split is along racial lines, the bottom 60% largely compromising Black, which the purpose of the story includes mixed race people and Asian descended from the era of slavery and colonial rule, controls 7% of the country's net wealth. Half of the population lives on $5 a day. That's astonishing. And that creates, I would imagine, a huge amount of consternation in the society itself. And any particular spark can set off that. That's kind of what I'm getting into from the standpoint of the ANC thing. If indeed the ANC was successful, or at the very least was aiming towards success, would the numbers have been this unequal? And I understand what you mean by Zuma, but was he able to do that much damage by himself? Or was that just somewhat of a general trend of the ANC not being able to grapple with the way resources have been structured and not being able to hit that hot rail of reparations in real terms that will change the way, you know, wealth is accrued in the country itself? I mean, tell me if I'm wrong on this. I've just in talking to people who dealt with South Africa or were South African who were Black, there have been certain criticisms of Mandela and certain criticisms of the ANC in the handling after the fall of apartheid. But tell me if I'm wrong. You know, you're a professor of this.
Yeah, surely when the change took place in when Mandela was released, the country was on a good course, and there were policies in place, at least rhetorically, black empowerment, redistribution, transference of power, and so on. That was rhetoric, but in reality, no redistribution took place. The tax resources and the richness of South Africa was not directed towards the poor. And for that, the government of Zuma was responsible. The population lost trust in government at all. They said they don't care about us, and that led to, for example, a movement, economic freedom front fighters who are themselves corrupt, who uses poverty to attack the current government, which tries its best to correct the increased inequality. Now, if you look at, for example, how other countries, how Germany, where I come from originally, dealt with the inequality which existed after reunification. They had a solidarity tax, which West Germans had to pay 7% for getting East Germany to the same level. None of these taxes were installed in South Africa. South Africa is a part of the capitalist West, and while the majority of the population is not aware of that and looted out of hunger and poverty, the redistribution and transfer of power took place in rhetoric, but not in reality. That is correct.
Okay, but here's the other thing. We've been talking about Jacob Zuma for most of this. We brought up Cyril Ramaphosa, the current leader, a few times, but Cyril Ramaphosa, no saint either. You've been talking about the appropriation of resources under Zuma, but Ramaphosa also, you know, widely accused of corrupt dealings. And the Marikana massacre, I believe that's how it's pronounced, which, interestingly enough, Trevor Noah, American comedian, defended back in the day. American comedian and news presenter, current host of The Daily Show, defended this back in the day, this massacre of 34 minors by the South African Police Service back in 2012, not that long ago at this point. That was Ramaphosa has defended that, right?
Yes, No, he didn't defend it. He asked for a Zuma-appointed police
to do against it.
To take a tough line on the striking miners.
Against it. Thank you. On the other side. I got that wrong. Thank you for the correction there.
Yeah.
But what is his perception? We've spoken widely about Zuma. How is Ramaphosa? You know, is he perceived as corrupt? Is he the saint in this picture? Was I wrong there in your perspective, Professor Adams?
He's a multi-billionaire. But he is not corrupt. He is a relatively principled man. But he is ineffective. He is not a social democrat in the sense that he wants a major change in the economic subsystem. He is paralyzed by the unity of the ANC he wants to preserve, and therefore he had to tread very carefully with the corruption investigations which he initiated and which are now triggered this upheaval. When that South Africa has an unbelievably free press, has a public debate, and many of the Zuma supporters fear that they will also be imprisoned shortly when the judicial system, whom they accuse are collaborators of capitalism, which is an idiotic accusation, which they want to avoid at all costs.
I think when they're saying that, it may be idiotic.
The Zuma faction in the ANC for the poverty, and not Ramaphosa, who also has a lot to answer for but not he apologized for Marikana, and he did not want now the army to repeat such a massacre, and instructed them under no circumstances should you use live ammunition in these riots.
You know, what happens from here? I mean, like you said, Ramaphosa was trying to maintain ANC unity, but that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case anymore. And not seem to be the case anymore. There seems that there will be some kind of break in the ANC. I mean, on some level there has to be, I would imagine. I mean, Zuma's in prison or is in jail for a period of time, and that in and of itself is creating this kind of crisis in the ANC. But more interesting or more important to me is, how does this get resolved? I mean, if indeed the riot is just a flashpoint, it's not specifically, okay, we love this guy so much, it's more so a flashpoint. And I forget the stat, but you have like the overwhelming majority of the country living on $5 a day, then pretty much anything can be the flashpoint, since the issue seems to be the poverty and the inability to kind of change the way the resources are being held. So are there any plans for that specifically? Otherwise, this seems to be just something that's going to replicate itself over and over again at various points.
That's a danger. And in my view, the best hope is for a split of the ANC, where a Mandela faction in the tradition of non-racialism and living together with Indians, coloreds, and whites in relative harmony will be the decisive force rather than the corrupt Zuma supporters. And much of business, much of the foundations like the Mandela Foundation and Thabo Mbeki Foundation recommend the government of national unity for the future, rather than ANC, a fraction, a government in control at the moment where infighting paralyzes any measures to get something done. Business, which basically, I go by looking at what the big corporations are saying. They are ready to even pay a higher tax for narrowing the gap between the rich and the poor. But that is a good outcome of these riots now, rather than going on as it was in the past.
Professor Adam, we only have a minute or so left with you. I wanted to pivot radically, but I first wanted to check with you to see if you'd be able and interested in going along with this with me. Looking at your doctoral advisor, I thought you might have some interesting takes on this. The current conversation about critical race theory in the United States and critical theory, which critical race theory is, coming out of, presumed and widely known to have come out of, and not just in name. Your doctoral advisor was Theodor Adorno, one of the members of this, the Frankfurt School, as it's been called retrospectively, this, critical seminal group of thinkers that created critical theory and were widely influential in America and other countries too. Would you be, interested in getting into that conversation for just a minute or two? Not what we originally brought you on to talk about, but you might have a vantage that a lot of people don't.
Yes. I mean, what Mandela called non-racialism cannot mean colorblindness in South Africa.
Yes.
It means the legacy of apartheid has to be recognized, and this recognition lies in efforts to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor. And this gap is a racial gap, and that has not happened. And critical race theory is heavily discussed in South Africa, and while it sometimes goes overboard in all kinds of woke rhetoric, it is important.
Okay, wait, but hang on a second. You are going to be more qualified to talk about this. If we can continue on for another minute or two, and maybe get you back on, because this is a fascinating conversation, but we only have so much time.
Yeah.
In your words, what is critical race theory? And when you say, looking at it from the perspective of the United States for a minute, where this debate has been raging, if it goes overboard, how does it go overboard? What is critical race theory? What is critical theory? What are their roles, and how do you see them being overstepped by people at this point? Professor Adam.
Critical race theory is important in recognizing that when people perceive something as real, and it becomes real. And if you interpret non-racialism in a liberal sense as colorblindness, you do not recognize that black and colored people are victims, and that has to be addressed. So critical non-racialism in the South African discussion is misinterpreted often, precisely because critical race theory is meant in the liberal sense as colorblindness, and you cannot be colorblind in a racist society.
Because it's unfair to the people who you're basically, meaning if we're pretending that the situation is neutral, or you're addressing, let's say we're back during the Native Americans situation, and somebody is reporting, and the reporters say, okay, we're going to be neutral, and we're going to talk about the Native Americans, and we're going to talk about what the whites are doing, et cetera. Well, you're going to be biased towards the Native Americans because this is not necessarily a two-sided argument. It's like in your discussion of reality or your discussion of history, there has to be this kind of understanding that not everybody had the exact same experience. And so I'm glad you said that it wasn't this notion of just pretending as if nothing is taking place and everything else. No, it's just a contextual version of history where you're recognizing that other people lived a different experience in that particular country as opposed to so many others. Shane?
One last question. Herbert, thank you for joining us, and thank you for sticking with us. You were, again, Theodor Adorno, one of the founding members, one of the best-known members of the Frankfurt School, whatever, this group of philosophers, political philosophers, analysts, psychologists, etc., who came from Frankfurt, Germany, and immigrated to the United States during World War II and were dramatically influential. You were there. How many of the conversations that we see happening today around this were presaged, were, foreseen and sort of spoken about then in a more primordial form? In other words, one way that I could view this from the outside without that much knowledge is these were conversations they were having 60, 70 years ago that we're still having, recapitulating to this date. Do you see that, or has the conversation changed? Professor Adam.
Was my PhD supervisor. He actually was more concerned with anti-Semitism than with the ghettos, with the black ghettos, which he must have had experienced in Los Angeles and in America. But he never talked about his Jewish identity. For him, humans were always humans. That was a great deficiency and the blind spot of critical theory. It did not deal with ethnicity. It did not deal with race. It dealt in abstract terms with philosophical issues. And I would criticize now my own education with these great theorists for that blind spot.
For lacking that. And that's very interesting. And I'm sure you've had many opportunities to think about this, writing as you have for many years about South Africa, which is what we were talking about with you for the most part. We got to close this out. We have been joined by Herbert Adam, and we had a great conversation. Professor Adam, thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you. I enjoyed that too.
Absolutely. Great to hear. Yeah, we had a great time. That was Professor Herbert Adam, author of more than a dozen books regarding ethnic conflict, human rights, comparative racism, and much more. He's a professor emeritus of political sociology at Simon Fraser University. He's also a recipient of the Konrad Adenauer Research Award and was elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming back, we're taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Lines.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Again, that's 202-521-1320. Now, I'm going to skip our first caller because I made a pledge to our second earlier on in the show. I'm sorry, Malik. We'll be coming back to you. But first, I want to go to Brave, calling in from ATL, Heads Up Control Room. Brave, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Oh, man, I'm going to keep it short because one of my points was going to be that I wish you guys would have Malik on for a while. And he's a guy. Okay, so I don't want to bump Malik. I'm going to be really quick. One very interesting conversation you guys had earlier concerning the information being. I was going to say spied on. I was able to catch some of it because of the fact that I was working on a piece for a customer, but really interesting conversation concerning Kim Iverson's conversation the other day and whether or not, Jamarl, you are in a bubble. Yes, you are in a bubble.
And I am too, man. Bubble. Yes.
But we're all in our bubbles, right?
Yeah.
The dangerous thing, not so much. I'm just trying to mess with you. You are, but I'm just trying to mess with you. But to the larger point, we all are. The dangerous thing is that when we see the administration and the U.S. government and social media shutting out whole sides of a conversation, that's really dangerous. And then labeling things misinformation. How is it? That's dangerous. And to me, they lose all credibility because we're now talking about things that at one time they said was misinformation. So, and I have to attribute this to, or I have to parallel this with what we saw with like 9/11 and all these great horrible things that happened in history, and they use it for power grabs. It is not misinformation to present more information on a topic. That is the truth and the idea of science, right? Like, you see what I'm saying? So I think that more information should be given on the other side of it. It's not even the other side. I think more information should be given to some of these things that we're talking about as far as the complaints about the vaccine and even the idea that if you're walking around and you haven't been vaccinated, you're a petri dish and all this stuff. My wife works in the hospital. She has a very serious job in the hospital. She comes and tells me every single day how they're filling up with people who are vaccinated and who are unvaccinated. You see what I'm saying? So there's more information here that we are not even being able to have a conversation on, or a serious conversation on, to get serious numbers on, because they're shutting it down and they're saying if you're not vaccinated, you're killing people, and that's just hyperbolic.
Brave, but it's pretty clear at this point. I mean, I get your anecdotal evidence,
sure.
But going from the standpoint of what's coming out of the various states, we're talking about like a 95% difference, meaning the people who are coming in that are infected, it's a 95% skew to those people who are unvaccinated. That's not me making that up.
Numbers are even being argumented. I'm trying to get out quick because I want to hear back.
Oh, and also, I mean, here's the thing.
Those numbers are even being argued. Let me just say this real quick.
Go for it.
Those numbers are being argued. If you go check out Whitney Webb's work, go check her recent work, go check out Ryan Christensen's report that he's doing. There's a lot of information out there. It's not just their opinion. This is stuff they've actually done research on and pulled the information from people who know what they're talking about. So all I'm saying is, I'm not saying I'm right. I'm not saying I'm wrong. All I'm saying is I'm not a scientist. So I don't want to just hear one side of anything. I want information and get.
I hear you.
And I'll just leave it there because I really want to hear Malik. So I'm going to just leave it there.
Brave, thank you for the call. Malik, I'm sorry. Before we get to you, I wanted to play one clip earlier, which Jamarl, I saw you submitted. I don't think we've gotten to this morning. This is the Biden clip, sort of correcting. It has to do with the misinformation thing that Brave was talking about. So I just wanted to get this out there. The other day, I think yesterday, we played the clip from Biden where he's talking about how Facebook is killing people. It's like he's about to get on Air Force One or whatever, and just briefly he's talking to the press pool, asking, what do you think about Facebook? It's killing people. He sort of laconically says before he walks away and boards his plane or whatever. That's what the comment that he made then. Scandalous, like Psaki's comments that if you're banned from one platform, you should be banned from all. Weird logic, but Biden later says this. Andre, let's play this clip. Yeah.
Facebook isn't killing people. These 12 people are out there giving misinformation. Anyone listening to it is getting hurt by it. It's killing people. It's bad information. My hope is that Facebook, instead of taking it personally that somehow I'm saying Facebook is killing people, that they would do something about the misinformation, the outrageous misinformation about the vaccine. That's what I mean.
Yeah, it's not the bullet, it's the gun. And it's not Facebook, it's the 12 people. Why that number? Why 12 people? You heard that, right?
Yeah, I don't know why he said 12 people, unless there's very specific people that he's thinking about that these guys are watching.
If it's only 12, are we really worried like, oh, gosh, our entire vaccination program coming to a screeching halt? That's not a sign of strength, is it? Hey, we've got Malik on the line.
Yeah, let's go to Malik.
All right. Malik,
hey,
you're on. What's going on?
Morning, fellas. Thank you for taking my call. I think if there are 12 people, I think I might know one of those 12 people.
Are you one of them, Malik? No, I'm just, what were you going to say?
Well, I had two items I wanted to touch on really quick. The discussion when you guys came on the air, and I'm trying. Obviously, you've been discussing the billionaire penis space race.
Jeff Bezos, yes.
And by the way, I saw this shit. What's his name? It does have a point. It does look in a weird
somewhat
phallic. Yeah,
but dude, that's
weirdly
a spaceship. I mean, even the boosters, they got those two boosters on the other side. Now those are two boosters on the lower part. What does that remind? Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. But Malik, I don't think that's.
Go ahead, Malik.
What's going on?
What's going on?
Yeah. Well, in a sense, part of my point does touch on that, because listen, in all of my readings since being a teenager. From the most wild conspiracy, quote unquote, conspiracy theory stuff, which I deem alternative information, to the things that come from people who are former military or people who have been friends with those who run with the upper echelon and the billionaire and millionaire class or classes. There is what the one theme that they do say that this is a club, that these are circles of people who you can draw a direct line. Speaking specifically of William Barr and his father Donald Barr,
with Epstein,
founded the Dalton School that hired Jeffrey Epstein.
Jeffrey Epstein, where Jeffrey Epstein worked as a mathematician inexplicably without a college degree, I believe, at the time. Yeah, there was a weird connection we were talking about before, Alec.
Epstein was a master hustler. He's a Brooklyn hustler. I guess to a degree it's to be admired.
Oh, God.
But Donald Barr wrote a book, and in that book, it's basically a wild space erotic novel that involved child sex slavery.
There's sex slavery. Yes, William Barr's father. This is absolutely correct. Thank you for bringing this back. It's been a while since I thought about this. Wrote a science fiction or speculative fiction. I don't want to step on anybody's toes. He wrote a science fiction novel with like erotic sexual slavery. And he was the guy who picked Jeffrey Epstein up.
Are you serious?
I'm 100% serious. Look into this yourself. Malik's 100% right.
Wow.
So, right. My point is that it's not just coincidental. These are whether these are plans that have been factually laid out. These are discussions and wet dreams of the billionaire class to escape the planet from the lower classes, the dregs of humanity, and reestablish themselves in colonies where they will take from all of these missing children and use them as sex slaves in labor.
Okay, but wait, here's the thing. I buy the general argument that this stuff kind of sometimes happens, but we went from a general weird fact to a specific hypothesis of, you get my point, Malik, and I'm willing to occasionally talk about it or even entertain it, but like after a beer or two at 11 p.m., not as my front-running theory for what's happening here. That's my point. Malik, I respect in my own way, but Malik, thank you for the call. We got to close this one out. We'll be back tomorrow at 7 a.m. Eastern, folks. Signing off, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. See you on the other side.